Hello everyone, today we will learn about another case. The case of Carolyn Watson. If kidnapping is not about satisfying the criminal's painful desires, then most often, the attackers seek money. But it is not always that simple. Some frightening actions have a much more mundane nature. Budgeree, in Australia, does not seem like a place where something terrifying could happen. It is a rural and remote area with a population of fewer than 200 people. Located in the peaceful region of Victoria, it is not even marked on all maps. The local community consists of only a few dozen families, and everyone knows each other well. However, this calm and measured pace did not prevent criminal stories from surfacing. The media began to write about the quiet and prosperous life in Budgeree, which changed in 2008 due to an event that made the entire continent shudder. A man named Julian Buchwald, 25, lived there. His family owns a large piece of land in the area. Julian had a girlfriend, 17-year-old Carolyn Watson, who lived in a neighboring town. They had been dating for about 2 years. Even in his younger years, Julian loved to explore the surroundings, especially his plot of land, to satisfy his natural curiosity. The difficult terrain, combined with the abundance of vegetation, offered plenty of opportunities for imagination and exploration. Both Julian and Carolyn continued to live with their parents. Despite dating for 2 years, they were very serious about their relationship. They often discussed the prospects of marriage. Being deeply religious individuals, just like their families, they even visited the local pastor of the church to declare their desire to marry during a Sunday service, where they had first met. Faith played a significant role in their lives. On the morning of March 4, 2008, Julian picked up Carolyn from her home for a picnic. She lived in the neighboring town of Churchill, which was a bit larger, with about 5,000 people. It was located about 20 minutes away by car from Budgeree. After leaving, they returned to Julian's house because he had forgotten some food in the car that could spoil in the heat. They gathered everything they needed and quickly left before it got too hot. Typically, Julian and Carolyn would relax on Julian's family property, where there were plenty of secluded spots that looked picturesque for a romantic outing. However, this time, they decided to venture further to visit a nearby waterfall. Around 3 p.m., they planned to return. Most of the journey went smoothly, but just before reaching the waterfall, Julian suddenly became alarmed. He noticed the carcass of an animal on the side of the road, so he slowed down and stopped at a safe distance around a small bend. He told Carolyn that he wanted to get out to check, as he thought the animal might still be alive and he could help it. This curiosity wasn't unusual for him. Carolyn had gotten used to these quirks and decided to wait for him inside the SUV while following his movements in the rearview mirror. At some point, Carolyn became distracted. When she looked back again, she no longer saw Julian. She assumed he had gone behind the hill or a turn, which is why she was out of view. But after some time, Julian still hadn't returned, and this began to worry her. He always came back quickly. Realizing they were far from the city and in the wilderness, Carolyn was afraid to get out of the car. Her boyfriend's absence increasingly troubled her. Suddenly, she caught sight of something even more frightening in the mirror. A figure darted into view. She saw a man standing next to the car. He looked threatening, fully dressed with gloves, and wearing a balaclava. Carolyn intended to lock the doors of the car, but the stranger had already jumped to her side, opened the door. Before she could react, pulled her out of the car and threw her to the ground. He covered her mouth with tape, silencing her screams, and she could barely resist. Within minutes, the kidnapper had bound and blindfolded her, then shoved her into the trunk of his car. Terrified, Carolyn hoped that Julian would return to save her. However, the kidnapper got behind the wheel and drove away, leaving her alone with her fear. She tried to escape, but the ropes were too tight to loosen. It felt like the trip lasted several hours. Eventually, the SUV came to a stop. The trunk opened. The kidnapper, still wearing a balaclava and gloves, stood in front of her again. He threw her onto the ground, and Carolyn realized she was still unable to free herself from her bindings. Despite her desperate attempts to do so, she had little idea of where she was located, but she saw that there was a dense forest surrounding her. The stranger tore off her clothes, using a knife to cut away her underwear, and then walked away. Carolyn was completely naked, lying next to the car. She heard a sound as if the kidnapper was digging. This noise came from a few meters away. Carolyn realized that she was about to die. She could not imagine what awaited her, but she understood that she would not get out of here alive. The only thing she could do in such a situation was to pray. At that time, Julian's mother and father noticed their absence and that both had left by car. Julian and Carolyn told their parents that they were going on a picnic together but did not specify the location. They were expected to return around 3 p.m., but the clock now read around 5 p.m. While everything could be attributed to youth and passion, Julian and Carolyn was always very responsible, was never late, especially for an extended period. Julian's mother called her son, but he didn't answer. Carolyn also ignored the calls. This was uncharacteristic for them, as they always stayed in touch. A delay of several hours seemed unthinkable, considering that they had not warned anyone that they would be late. The parents inspected the area around the house but found no traces of Julian and Carolyn. A search operation alone on such a large piece of land seemed pointless, so Julian's mother decided to return to the house and wait for them in the driveway. Suddenly, she discovered something strange. She saw a glint as from glass and found a bottle with a note inside that was stuck in the fence mesh. She read it, and its contents horrified her. Some criminal had written that he had kidnapped Julian and Carolyn. The text was full of obscene language. The criminal warned the parents not to report it to the police, otherwise, Carolyn would be burned alive, and Julian would die in agony. The kidnapper spoke of some business he had to attend to, stating that if he succeeded, the children would return home safe and sound, but only if the parents complied with all his demands. This message horrified she. Though she panicked, she was not going to follow the demands of the criminal and reported the matter to the police. Law enforcement officers immediately responded to the call and began to inspect the area, which was rugged terrain with a lot of vegetation. There was much work to be done. Relatives hoped that Julian and Carolyn had secluded themselves in the area since they rarely left Butchery. The family's situation worsened when Julian's relatives found out that both Julian's and Carolyn's families had received ominous notes. The families of Julian and Carolyn and the detectives met to discuss what had happened. Carolyn's father found a similar bottle on the porch of their house, which contained a message insisting that they not contact the police, also threatening to kill Julian and Carolyn. Even worse, he promised to deal with the entire family if his demands were violated. Everyone wondered what could possibly have motivated the hatred toward this sweet couple of young people. Initially, it was believed that that were just a cruel joke. Now the police had two notes, as well as the real disappearance of Julian and Carolyn. Until late in the evening, neither Julian nor Carolyn had made contact. The handwriting in both letters was identical. That means that the two families may have a common enemy. However, no one had the slightest idea who he might be. It was curious that the note contained a symbol that seemed to have an occult nature. Some group that considered Christians their enemies. This was considered a valuable clue, and it was quickly discovered that it was used by a certain satanic cult called the Order of Nine Angles. The history of this organization was checked and found that it had appeared in Great Britain back in the 60s, was actively luring in members in the 70s. However, the cult did not become widespread and did not have a large number of followers. Some of its members were being held accountable for extremist ideology and various threats. As the activists gained notoriety, the group opened branches in several countries around the world. Their ideology included isolating their members from the rest of society. They openly advocated for violence and committing crimes against perceived enemies, specifically targeting Christians whom they recognized as opponents to be destroyed. The most frightening aspect of this movement's activities was the propaganda promoting human sacrifices, which horrified families and prompted the police to intensify their efforts. Julian and Carolyn were simply devout Christians. Interestingly, until that point, the activities of this group had only been observed in Australia. They could potentially attempt to declare themselves by committing their first ritual murder. Satanists might use the sacrifice of Julian and Carolyn to gain fame from there began to gather like-minded people. The relatives did not receive any news for several days. Julian's car was declared wanted, but that didn't help. All the detectives' efforts proved in vain as they couldn't find either Julian and Carolyn or any leads on where to continue searching. Considering who Carolyn and Julian may have contacted, it was believed that it would be impossible to return they alive. The relatives knew that they had packed only a small amount of food meant to last a few hours. They had no worn clothes and no equipment. They did not have tents to survive the temperature fluctuations that occur in Australia during the day and night. There were also concerns about dangerous areas where Julian and Carolyn could fall victim to predators. The scorching heat and hunger posed significant threats. Even if they escaped from their kidnappers, encounters with wild or poisonous animals could be deadly. The rescue operation transitioned to a recovery effort, but this, too, yielded no results. 6 days passed during which the families of Julian and Carolyn did not find any peace. Suddenly, a message arrived: Julian and Carolyn had been found. What was most astonishing was that both were relatively safe. They had simply emerged onto the roadway near the Alpine National Park. A passing farmer stopped to help and immediately reported their situation to the police. It was not surprising that law enforcement officers were unable to find any trace of the individuals Julian and Carolyn. The national park was several hundred kilometers from where they lived, requiring about a 6-hour drive by car. Julian sustained serious injuries. While making their way through the desert, he suffered sunburn, cuts from thorny bushes, blisters, and bruises all over his body. Nonetheless, aside from the extreme stress of their ordeal, they were otherwise fine. Detectives met with Julian and Carolyn to gather information and prevent potentially dangerous criminals from operating in the area. They first communicated with Carolyn, who detailed the horrific trials she endured after being kidnapped. She described being undressed, thrown to the ground, where she lay and prayed just a few meters away from her kidnapper, who was digging in the earth. She was certain that this was her grave. This agonizing wait continued interminably until the sounds of digging stopped. Carolyn heard footsteps moving away, and everything went silent. Realizing that the criminal had abandoned her, she knew she could not remain passive. Quickly, she attempted to free herself from her ropes, but they did not yield. Her hands hurt as she rubbed them until they bled. Suddenly, she heard Julian's voice calling her name as he crawled closer. He managed to rip off her blindfold and the duct tape from her mouth. Julian, also tied up and without clothes, had managed to free his hands. This allowed Julian to finally escape and then free Carolyn. However, the danger was not over. The kidnapper could return at any moment. There was no car, but the abandoned backpack and scattered contents of the trunk remained. They found supplies that they had taken with them for a picnic, gathered everything, and fled into the thicket. They wanted to get as far away from that place as possible to plan their next steps. Along the way, Julian recounted his story. He approached an animal lying on the side of the road to examine the body, but as he leaned over, he heard footsteps approaching quickly from behind. He didn't have time to react before he was attacked. He was struck on the back of the head hard enough to lose consciousness. According to Julian, when he awoke a few hours later, he immediately began calling out for Carolyn. The criminal was no longer nearby, having escaped in an SUV. Over the next few days, they desperately tried to reach the road, making their way through thick bushes. They risked encountering wild animals. Even the slightest bite from an Australian poisonous spider or snake could be fatal. Their supplies were very limited since they had packed only a small amount of food for their picnic, specifically. During the day, Julian and Carolyn suffered from the suffocating heat, risking sunstroke. At night, they struggled to stay warm, sharing a single sleeping bag. The situation was compounded by the fear that the kidnapper could pursue them and find them at any moment. Both Julian and Carolyn were completely unaware of why this had happened to them. The situation worsened when, a few days later, they unwittingly returned to the same place where they had been held hostage. As it turned out, they had made a large circle. Nevertheless, Julian took advantage of the situation. Despite his fear of being caught, he was able to steal clothes and any remaining food, improving the dire condition of the starving couple. However, everything came to an end quickly. Carolyn fell into despair, feeling that they could not be saved. and found solace only in prayer. Finally, God heard her pleas. After 6 days, they were able to find their way out of the dense bushes. They emerged onto the road, where the police spoke to Julian, for the most part, confirmed his girlfriend's account, except for the part where he claimed to be unconscious. Julian and Carolyn was sent to stay in the hospital and then with their relatives, but law enforcement officers had no time to rest. Despite the miraculous rescue of the kidnapping victims, the armed forces still faced a real threat that the dangerous organization responsible for the kidnapping would continue its destructive activities. It had to be stopped at any cost. Before bloodshed could begin, the police decided to go to the place from which the prisoners had escaped. They found cut pieces of duct tape, clothing, a shovel, and other items, all of which were checked. To the detectives' amazement, some items belonged to Julian, including a rope found in his house's barn. There was also disturbed earth that had been dug up. The detectives discovered a balaclava, black clothing, gloves, and other things described by Carolyn. From that moment, Julian's story became even more disturbing. In particular, Julian was never able to show any signs of the head injuries he claimed to have sustained. Any such injuries should have remained visible, especially if Julian had indeed delivered a blow that could have knocked him out for several hours. They decided to talk to Julian again. From the start, the detectives made it clear that they had good reason to suspect him of kidnapping. Julian was nervous but insisted on his story, referring to his beloved, who confirmed much of what he said. However, within a few hours, he was brought to justice. Julian admitted that he had organized the kidnapping himself. He had bought the items he intended to use for the kidnapping in advance, taking some from home, including items that allowed him to hide his face from Carolyn. He had even trained for some time to tie knots that would not injure when immobilizing someone. The cult symbols used in the letters were meant to scare his parents and Carolyn's relatives into not contacting the police, preventing detective intervention. Julian deliberately used foul language in the letters he sent to the Buchwald and Watson families. No one thought he would say such words. Julian had deliberately chosen the longest route to the waterfall to avoid detection and confuse the tracks. The guy kept a lookout for anything suspicious that could attract attention and give him the opportunity to implement his plan. He eventually noticed an animal carcass on the side of the road and decided it was time to act. Julian stopped around a corner to hide from Carolyn's sight, changed his clothes, and returned to the car to play out the rest. The place he had chosen to take Carolyn was far away, allowing them to stay away from people. According to him, when Carolyn heard sounds of earth being dug up, he was actually not making a grave but getting rid of evidence. After that, he got into the car and drove away to hide it in the woods, then he returned to Carolyn. Along the way, he got rid of his clothes and wrapped ropes around his hands to make himself look like a kidnapped person. After that, he began to call her name in a weak voice, pretending that he had just regained consciousness after a blow to the head. The kidnapping was carefully planned. He had items that helped they survive this difficult period. Even the fact that they returned to the place from which they had escaped was part of the plan. However, one aspect still remained unclear. Why stage such a spectacle? 22-year-old Julian admitted that he wanted to marry Carolyn immediately. They had already been dating for 2 years, but she did not agree. 17-year-old Carolyn planned to finish school, decide on her future, go to college, get a job, become independent before finally tying the knot and starting a family. At the same time, both were devout Christians who believed in abstaining from intimate before marriage. He did not want to wait so long. He desperately wanted to satisfy his intimate desires, so he staged the kidnapping. He specifically planned everything so that they would both be isolated during their wandering through the dense thickets. Julian tried various tactics to persuade his girlfriend to be intimate. He reasoned that they might not survive this adventure, and it was worth trying intimate. He also convinced Carolyn that in the face of death, they had entered into an alliance in the fight for their lives, which he equated with marriage. Julian even tried to persuade her that they needed to engage in intimate intercourse to keep warm at night, claiming he had read about such a method somewhere. Carolyn was unwavering, continued to refuse, and insisted on her beliefs, convinced that God would save them. Therefore, his plan ultimately failed. Among the items Julian had prepared for the trip, there was a map of the national park. They had not actually gotten lost when Julian realized Carolyn was not going to give up. Therefore, he decided to lead them out of this national park. After Julian's confession, he was slapped by Carolyn, charged with kidnapping and perjury. The trial was scheduled for August 2009. Julian was not held in jail after the trial because his wealthy family posted bail. Julian took advantage of the situation and made another attempt to escape punishment. In September 2009, he obtained an Indian passport, boarded a plane, and flew to China. The document was obviously fake but of sufficient quality to fool Australian security services. Julian dyed his hair black and spent a long time sunbathing to darken his skin as much as possible, even though he was fair-skinned and required many tanning sessions. Although he managed to fly out of Australia, the Indian security services were more vigilant and refused to let him enter the country. Julian was arrested in Singapore. It was assumed that India was only the first stop on his journey and that Germany was intended to be his final destination. After that, he received a sentence of 7 years and 3 months for kidnapping, as well as an additional 6 months for escaping. He tried to challenge the court's decision, arguing that it was too harsh, but could not contest the fact that the kidnapping in this incident was a significant issue. In another unexpected turn of events, it was revealed that Julian was originally from Germany. His family had moved to Australia at an early age. In 2014, the Immigration Service considered the possibility of canceling his visa. Julian tried to resist this decision but failed. In 2016, he was deported to Germany, ending up in a country where he did not know the language at all. There were no relatives or acquaintances with whom he could start anew. His further fate is not reliably known, and there is no information about whether he went to prison. According to some sources, Julian's situation has worsened. On the other hand, Carolyn could not come to her senses for a long time after such a betrayal. It was difficult for her to learn to trust people, especially men. What happened in her life afterward is unknown. Hello everyone, today we will learn about another case. The case of Lauren Johansson. That evening, it was quite quiet. A light wind rustled the treetops near the cemetery by the Wolf River. A car sat on the side of an abandoned road, motionless and untouched for hours. But something was wrong. When the police arrived, a man jumped out and ran into the woods. The officers rushed after him, but the thick undergrowth, the dark night, and the uneven ground prevented them from catching the fugitive. Meanwhile, Robert Lance Johansson, Lauren's father, broke past the police, his heart pounding. His daughter had been missing for days, and now her car was right in front of him. He ran up to the door and took a deep breath. What he saw inside changed everything. Lauren Johansson was born on October 30th, 2001, in Ocean Springs, a quiet and picturesque town. The town attracted tourists with its green alleys, cozy beaches, and beautiful landscapes. But for Lauren, it was not just a place on the map, it was her home. Here, she grew up, surrounded by the love of her family. It was where she learned to be strong. Lauren grew up in a family where caring for others was part of life. Her parents, Lance and Tamla Robinson Johansson, surrounded their daughter with warmth. However, their life was not easy. Both of her older sisters had serious health problems, and from childhood, Lauren helped her parents take care of them. It was then that she learned patience and compassion, qualities that became part of her character. She was always ready to come to the rescue. She never complained and always put others before her own needs. From childhood, Lauren adored animals and was fascinated by wild birds. Her parents supported her hobby, and when Lauren became a teenager, she began to actively help in animal shelters. She looked after homeless cats and cared for horses after injuries. She treated wild animals and made it her life's goal to open her own shelter for rescued animals, to help those who could not help themselves. For this, she saved every cent, working since school. Lauren always wanted to help not only animals but also people. That's why she decided to become a nurse. She attended the University of Southern Mississippi and was successful in her studies despite working part-time jobs. Not only that, she also wanted to combine her studies with volunteer work. She worked day and night because she wanted to change the world for the better. In her senior year of high school, Lauren met Bryson Rivers. He was an athlete admired by everyone, raised in a religious and conservative family. As the eldest son, he carried a great responsibility since childhood, learning about discipline, respect for elders, and leadership qualities. He achieved success in sports, especially in football and athletics. Loved by teachers and admired by classmates, it seemed that he and Lauren were the ideal couple, supporting each other's dreams, they appearing happier than anyone else. However, this outer ideal hid a terrible truth, one that led to that night when they found her car on an abandoned road. At the beginning of their relationship, Bryson seemed caring and attentive. He showed interest in her life, listened to her daily experiences, and supported her dreams. Lauren appreciated his care. Bryson was proud of her kindness and determination. But over time, his care turned into obsessive control. At first, he just wanted to spend more time with her. Then he began to get jealous, asking more and more questions and urging her to communicate less with others. Soon, this behavior became a requirement. Lauren's friends noticed that she had changed. She began to avoid parties and meetings, stopped discussing Bryson. If someone asked about him, she justified his behavior, even when it became more manipulative. Lauren convinced herself that it was all because of love. Bryson had agitated outbursts of aggression mixed with displays of affection. If she tried to set boundaries, he would create a scene, only to apologize later and convince her it was for the sake of their future. He pressed on her feelings of guilt, saying she was the one provoking his jealousy. She didn't understand that she was in a toxic cycle. He would shout, then apologize, promising that everything would change, only for history to repeat itself. Later, when she told her friends, she tried to justify him, but they saw that she had changed. She became quieter, talked less about her feelings, and justified his actions more and more. He abruptly cut her off during public conversations, and when someone paid attention to her, he would react negatively. One time, when Lauren simply thanked a waiter for good service, Bryson's face changed immediately, and he spent the rest of the evening making sarcastic comments. She felt guilty even though she had done nothing wrong. Lance, her father, felt that something was wrong. He was worried and tried to talk to his daughter, but she brushed him off. Over time, she became more and more withdrawn. She didn't realize that she was no longer in control of her life. By December 2023, Lauren and Bryson were planning a trip, which she thought would be a romantic getaway, but he saw it as an opportunity to tighten his grip. Bryson was on leave from the army, and Lauren was on winter break from college. She wanted a change of scenery, while he wanted to isolate her. At first, everything seemed perfect. They walked around the city, visited the sights, and ate dinner at nice restaurants. Bryson seemed calm, but underneath the surface of this happiness, there was tension. Lauren felt this but ignored it. She believed that everything would be fine. On December 11th, Lauren and Bryson went to a bar to watch a football match. For Bryson, it was an important evening, and he was not going to miss it. At first, things were going quietly, but as soon as Lauren went to the restroom, the situation suddenly changed. She asked the waiter where the restroom was and left. A minute later, the same waiter accidentally walked down the same corridor, not even suspecting the effect this would have on Bryson. When Lauren returned to the table, she immediately felt that something was wrong. Bryson was tense, his gaze was harsh, and his voice was sharp. The more Lauren tried to calm him down, the worse it became. His accusations grew more absurd, her voice got louder, and his anger intensified. The people in the bar noticed the tension, but no one intervened. They left before anything serious could happen, but the real nightmare was just beginning. As soon as they got into the car, Bryson immediately locked the doors. He turned off the sound on her phone, snatched it, and put it in his pocket. Lauren was trapped. Bryson screamed and raged at her without explaining where he was taking her, but he continued to hit and intimidate her. His threats became more and more terrifying. Lauren was shaking with fear when the car stopped at a deserted park. She understood he wasn't going to let her go just like that. Lauren carried a gun in her bag just in case she tried to get it, but Bryson was faster. He snatched the bag from her hands. Now, she had no chance to save herself. For the next hour, he continued to hit her, speaking with frightening coldness. He smirked and said, "Her face now looks like a bowling ball." This phrase was accidentally recorded on her phone. At some point, Bryson made a mistake. He called his mother and screamed into the phone for help. Hearing Lauren's screams, his mother immediately called the police. Meanwhile, Lauren's father saw her location on the family GPS tracking. The police were already on their way. The officers heard her screams coming from the locked car, broke down the door, and saw Lauren beaten, shaking, with a swollen face, marks all over her body. Bryson was arrested shortly afterwards. Lauren was taken to the hospital. Her injuries were serious, and doctors were shocked by the level of violence she had suffered. Despite everything she had been through, Lauren didn't want to ruin his life. She refused to press charges. Even from jail, Bryson found ways to contact her. Every time, he said the same thing: "Forgive me, I will change, I need you," and part of her wanted to believe him. She changed her testimony to mitigate his guilt, but it was a mistake that changed the course of the whole case. Bryson remained in custody awaiting trial. The evidence against him was overwhelming: audio recordings from Lauren's phone, her initial testimony, and doctors' reports of her injuries. The court set bail at $250,000, which kept him behind bars temporarily. After 6 months, lawyers asked for the amount to be reduced. The judge agreed and reduced the bail to $150,000. Lauren's family was in shock. They knew that if he got out, Lauren would be in danger. But Bryson's mother quickly raised the money, and he was released while awaiting trial. After his release, Bryson was required to wear a GPS bracelet. He was forbidden to approach Lauren, write, or call her. Soon, a more serious situation arose. A few days after his release, Bryson's bracelet battery began to run low. He received several warnings about the need to charge it, but he ignored them. Eventually, the device completely discharged and became useless. The system immediately recorded a failure, and the authorities were alerted. However, they did not take urgent measures. Instead of responding immediately, they wasted hours and then a whole day without taking any action. No one reported it. He was again at large without supervision. Lance, Lauren's father, found out about it only through a voicemail from the police, in which they calmly informed him that Bryson had disappeared. They didn't even tell him exactly when it had happened. Robert was furious. He immediately called the police demanding action, but the police still dragged their feet. Hours passed, then days, and Bryson was on the run. Then Lauren disappeared. On July 2, 2024, Lance tried to call her, but the phone was silent. Soon, he received a strange message from her number. The text seemed alien, as if it hadn't been written by her. Lance felt a cold fear. He immediately called his other daughter, Caitlin, who lived with Lauren, and asked her to check if everything was okay. What she saw made her immediately call her father. The door to their apartment was wide open, all the security cameras were turned off, and Lauren's car was gone. Lance immediately reported his daughter missing, but the police hesitated again. A day passed before they finally agreed to track her car. On July 3, 2024, the police finally tracked Lauren's GPS. Her car was found in a remote area near the cemetery by the Wolf River. It was an isolated area surrounded by thick forest, far from busy roads. Lance rushed there as soon as he found out. When the officers approached the car, a man suddenly jumped out and rushed into the forest. It was Bryson Rivers. The police chased after him, but he disappeared among the trees. Lance, frantic with fear, rushed to the car. He opened the door, saw Lauren was lying in the back seat, her body wrapped in black plastic bags, her face and head covered. As a doctor, he had seen many terrible injuries, but nothing could prepare him for this. The police began to record evidence, but one thing was clear: this was not just a murder, it was a brutal, monstrous massacre. When forensic experts began to examine the car, they were confronted with a terrible sight. Blood stains on the upholstery indicated that Lauren had been subjected to a brutal and prolonged attack until her death. Lance was unable to leave the crime scene even when his health began to deteriorate from the stress he had experienced. He refused to leave until the investigators had finished their work. The search for Bryson continued for several hours, with helicopters equipped with thermal imaging scanning the forest for the slightest trace. Finally, a thermal signal was recorded, and the police surrounded him from all sides. After 9 hours of searching, Bryson was detained. He did not resist, his face remained calm, as if he did not realize what he had done. During interrogation, Bryson tried to give his version of events. He admitted that he came to Lauren's house that day knowing that she would be alone. He was angry that she no longer answered his calls. He waited for her to come out and then approached her. According to him, he just wanted to talk, but when Lauren refused and tried to leave, he grabbed her, dragged her into the car. She struggled, but he locked the doors and drove away. He took her to a deserted place outside the city, convinced that they needed to talk alone, but the conversation quickly turned into an argument. Lauren demanded that he let her go and threatened to call the police, which made him even angrier. He started yelling, blaming her for all their problems and for their breakup. When she tried to open the door and run out, he pushed her back into the car. He claims he was just trying to calm her down, but he hit her until she stopped moving. When he realized Lauren wasn't breathing, he tried to bring her to her senses, but it was too late. Realizing she was dead, he made a conscious decision. He took a blanket from the trunk, wrapped her body, and put it in the back seat. He then drove her to the cemetery by the Wolf River, where he left the car, planning to return later to get rid of the evidence. However, the police found the car before he could carry out his plan. Lauren's death and Bryson's arrest caused a wave of media outrage. This case was not only about the crime itself, people were shocked by how much the justice system had failed. How did it happen that a man with obvious signs of danger was released? Why did no one stop him earlier? How could the court ignore the evidence? And most importantly, could this murder have been prevented? Lauren's relatives, despite their grief, did not remain silent. They made a statement demanding reforms in the system so that such things would not happen again. They repeatedly demanded accountability for the mistakes that led to their daughter's murder. However, Bryson was not the only one condemned by society. Bryson's mother, who posted bail for him, faced particularly harsh criticism from the public. Despite the outrage, Lauren's family did not blame her directly. For them, it was more important to address the flaws in the system rather than punish a specific individual. Hundreds of people attended Lauren's funeral, friends, relatives, and residents of her hometown. She was not just a victim, she was a person who dreamed of helping others so that her goodness would not go to waste. In her memory, her family created a foundation that would help save animals, as Lauren had dreamed of doing in life. The trial of Bryson began in December 2024. He was charged with kidnapping, first-degree murder, and destruction of evidence. On Thursday, Rivers was taken by police to the county courthouse in downtown Hattiesburg, where he appeared before Judge Bob Helfrich for arraignment. So far, Bryson Rivers has pleaded not guilty to the murder of Lauren Johansson. The trial date has been set for June 25, 2025. As the trial continues, one question remains unanswered: will he receive the punishment he truly deserves, or will there be another loophole that allows him to evade full responsibility? For Lauren's family, this fight has long transcended a single case. They now aim to ensure that no one else has to endure what they experienced. On December 24, 1988, an Arizona police station received a call from the area in Pinal County, not far from the so-called Superstition Mountains. Witnesses had found the body of a young woman with signs of violence. She was in casual clothes and without a purse or any identifying documents. Therefore, the victim could not be immediately identified. There was a deep wound on her leg, and blood was on her body. Her neck had been cut and was completely covered with stab wounds. All of her clothes were soaked in blood. An autopsy of the woman's body revealed that the injuries sustained were much more serious than they initially appeared to the witness. The victim had several deep, penetrating wounds in her neck that pierced the spine and practically separated her head from her body. 4 additional stab wounds had broken 2 ribs and pierced her heart. The most terrible marks were barely noticeable bruises on her left temple and eyebrow. The forensic expert was not certain, but suspected that these were marks from the sole of a shoe. On the ground where the body was found, forensic experts discovered similar marks, suggesting that she had been deliberately pressed to the ground with a foot to limit her mobility and inflict these fatal wounds. In addition to these obvious injuries, the unidentified victim had traces of prolonged beating on her face and body, scratches on her knees, and a defensive wound on one of her hands. It was clear that the crime had been committed with intent. Detectives believed that the killer should be sought among her acquaintances, but she had not yet been identified. However, that same day, the situation changed when the county police department received a call from Kathy Monkman, who reported that her older sister had gone missing the day before. The missing woman's name was Cynthia Monkman. Kathy explained that her sister had not shown up for a Christmas party, which was planned for the night before Christmas Eve. This was strange because Cynthia had been actively involved in organizing the event. She hadn't even warned anyone that she would not be able to come. After that, she stopped answering calls. Kathy did not immediately report Cynthia's disappearance to the police. She thought it was possible that Cynthia might have changed her plans. However, the next day, they were supposed to fly home together to Illinois. Kathy left a note with the flight information and a ticket for the 7:30 a.m. departure. She still hoped that Cynthia would show up, but when Kathy got on the plane and did not see her sister in the seat next to her, she realized that something terrible had happened. Kathy provided a description of the missing person that matched the found unidentified body, including the timeline of Cynthia's disappearance, which was just a day before her body was discovered in the desert. Detectives learned that shortly before her death, Cynthia had spontaneously married a man she had met a couple of months earlier. After comparing all the known facts, law enforcement officers came to the conclusion that they had found 30-year-old Cynthia Monkman, who was later identified by her sister and confirmed by dental records. Cynthia was born on September 16, 1958, in Pensacola, Florida. Her younger sister was born a year later, and from the very beginning, they were inseparable. Their father, Jack, was a psychologist, while their mother, Dorothy, became a housewife when the girls were born. Another child, a boy, was born 2 years later. The family moved to Champaign, Illinois, where their father was invited to work. The life of this close-knit family turned tragic when Dorothy discovered she had breast cancer. 2 years later, despite all efforts, Dorothy died, leaving Jack as a single father with 3 children aged 6, 4, and 2. It was not easy, but with the help of relatives, Jack managed to raise the younger generation successfully. After finishing school, the sisters remained inseparable. They attended college together, had a lot of fun and attended parties like other young people. They often made impromptu trips to meet old friends across the states. In 1980, Kathy decided to move to Arizona to study in nursing school, and Cynthia decided to follow her 2 years later. Cynthia eventually received a master's degree in public health and began a career as a nutritionist. In 1983, at the age of 25, she was offered a breakthrough opportunity to head a health center in a large Minnesota corporation and decided to take advantage of it. Having to move thousands of kilometers away from her sister to gain experience in her career, she soon grew tired of loneliness. In 1986, Cynthia decided to move back and settled in an apartment near her sister. Cynthia was a vibrant and attractive woman, always the center of attention. She had many suitors. In the first month after moving back, she met Mark, a DJ at a radio station and a local celebrity. They started dating. They led an active lifestyle and had a lot of fun, but their relationship was full of ups and downs. Mark wanted to maintain his party lifestyle, while Cynthia was looking for something more stable and was ready to think about starting a family. In July, 29-year-old Cynthia suggested to her boyfriend that they break up. After the breakup, she grieved for some time and found it hard to cope with this difficult moment in her life. To unwind, she and her sister went on a short trip to the beach in California. Despite the separation, the two young people still had mutual feelings for each other. On October 8th, at a party in a popular local club, Cynthia met two brothers, Michael Apelt and Rudy Alfred Apelt, who were both tall, attractive guys from Germany. Cynthia immediately felt a mutual attraction, Kathy realizing that her sister was head over heels in love. Michael was the youngest of 7 siblings, 5 years younger than Cynthia. The young people spoke English poorly, making communication quite difficult. However, as Cynthia put it, they were on the same wavelength, so they understood each other perfectly without words. The next day, Cynthia could not talk about anyone else. When she went to have breakfast with her sister, she even mentioned that Michael had said several times he was ready to marry her. Kathy was very skeptical about such a bold statement right after their first meeting, but Cynthia calmed her down, saying it was just the best way to forget about the failed relationship with Mark. Her friend Annette, who had gone to the club with them, met Rudy, and the whole group started going on double dates. Gradually, the couples began more serious relationships. Only a week passed before Rudy moved in alongside Michael, who also moved in with Cynthia. Everything happened so quickly that Kathy was amazed at the changes in her sister's life. She considered these hasty decisions would not lead to anything good. The relationship continued until December 17th when Cynthia and her boyfriend attended a friend's wedding. There, Kathy noticed a wedding ring on Cynthia's finger. It turned out she had already married Michael. Later, Cynthia confessed to her sister that it happened on October 28th, just 3 weeks after they met. Kathy was shocked by such a rapid change in Cynthia's behavior. For the first time, she was keeping a secret from her sister. Now, they found Cynthia's lifeless body. Detectives analyzed the scant evidence collected after her body was discovered, including tire tracks left in the desert sand. It was clear she had been taken there intentionally to be dealt with and abandoned in a deserted place. The criminal likely expected they would never find her. However, he made a mistake, and some people accidentally discovered Cynthia. Having learned the story of the last months of the victim's life, detectives suspected that either a stormy affair with the new guy or the abandoned boyfriend could be responsible for this brutality. The degree of cruelty indicated that it was something very personal. In addition to the tire tread prints, they found several traces, including a piece of nylon cord and a blood-soaked beach towel. Detectives continued to communicate with the close circle of Cynthia and analyzed her acquaintances. A few weeks before the breakup, Cynthia learned that one of Mark's ex-girlfriends had been found dead. The investigation into this crime by the Supreme Court was still ongoing by that time. Cynthia knew that Mark was trying to get back together with her. They had only spoken 3 days before the tragedy. There had been a verbal altercation when Cynthia admitted she had married someone else. She managed to resolve the conflict, but Mark said he was going to come to town for Christmas and suggested that Cynthia meet him. Cynthia did not come to the party organized before leaving, and no one answered the calls. When morning came, Michael called Kathy, shouting into the phone, trying to understand where his wife was. It was obvious that he was drunk. Kathy tried to extract some information from him about when he last saw her sister. When know that Cynthia was supposed to meet with Mark. At this time, Kathy assumed her sister might have run away with her ex. Kathy arrived at Cynthia's apartment, hoping to find some information about her, but found nothing. The only people against whom suspicions remained were Mark and current husband, Michael. Cynthia's photo was all over the news, and her relatives received a letter sent by her on the eve of the planned trip. It looked creepy because they already knew about her death. In this letter, she discussed her relationship with her husband. She expressed a desire for them to all meet and get to know each other properly. They couldn't communicate immediately with Michael due to the language barrier. However, on the day Cynthia's relatives learned about her death, one of the detectives from the police department was sent to talk to Michael. He was inexperienced in dealing with murders and brutal crimes, but he was chosen because he spoke German fluently. Michael opened up extensively and was amazed to find someone in the police department who spoke German. The detective was most interested in the chronology of events, particularly Cynthia's and Michael's movements on that fateful day, December 23rd. As it turned out, Michael became tense from the very beginning but managed to recount the events. According to him, Cynthia's car needed maintenance, so they took her car to the dealer for repairs. After that, they rented a car to return to the apartment. On the day of the incident, Cynthia was busy preparing for the trip and mentioned planning to meet friends around 10 p.m. Michael claimed that around 7 p.m., while he was taking a shower, he heard his wife talking on the phone. He noted it was a very aggressive emotional discussion, but he had no idea who was on the other end of the line since he couldn't make out most of the words, or even the names. After Cynthia hung up, she yelled that something needed to be taken care of and left without providing any explanation. While her husband was still in the shower, Cynthia took her luggage, purse, and went to meet her friends. Michael willingly cooperated with the authorities, allowing detectives to search his apartment and car. In addition, he provided a receipt from a restaurant dated the same day, on December 23, 1988. When the police listened to the answering machine recordings, one in particular attracted their attention. At 10 a.m., Mark called, said he had seen a girl resembling Cynthia in the news reports and had heard that she was missing. Worried about her, he asked to call back to confirm if everything was okay. Considering that he was in another state, it seemed strange that Mark had managed to see the news reports so quickly. According to the detective's calculations, during this period, they barely appeared on screens, making it doubtful as if Mark was trying to clear himself out of spite. Ironically, due to his limited knowledge of English, Michael did not yet realize that his wife had died. When Michael, Rudy, and Annette were taken to the police station, they reported what had happened. Michael was very emotional, crying and even screaming as he tried to understand why this had happened. However, after that, all three were taken to different rooms for independent interrogations. Shoe prints were checked, hair and blood samples were collected from all three. At the same time, their alibis were confirmed. After that, all three were released, as they seemed unlikely suspects. Questions remained only regarding Mark, who was behaving suspiciously. The investigator leading this case flew to California to talk to the radio DJ. During this time, Cynthia's phone in Illinois received multiple calls, and the caller left numerous messages on the answering machine, supposedly trying to figure out what was going on. The detective found that Mark had been working on the day of the murder. After his shift, he rented a car, went to Los Angeles to spend Christmas with his mother and sister. Much to the surprise of the law enforcement officer, his alibi was confirmed. He could not have been Cynthia's killer. Cynthia's burial was scheduled for December 31, 1988. During the funeral, when the floor was given to Michael, he could not even utter a word. He had an emotional breakdown. He just stood there crying until his brother, Rudy, pulled him off the podium. However, when everyone was driving around after the funeral ceremony, Kathy drove past the car in which the brothers were sitting and saw them laughing with Annette. This seemed strange. Now it looked as if Michael had been pretending to grieve the whole time. Kathy informed the detectives about her doubts regarding Michael, after which the law enforcement officers decided to interview all the suspects in the case again, as something didn't add up. The first one at the police station was Kathy, who provided more details about the love story that preceded the crime. Now, it seemed to the investigators that the brothers from Germany were suspiciously secretive about everything. They avoided sharing details about their work, tried not to specify unnecessary information about themselves and their past. Kathy recalled that a few days after meeting them, she saw them going to the cheapest motel in town, despite their previous claims of staying at the most expensive motel and being involved in banking activities. She could even swear that after their first visit to her apartment, she lost $100 in cash. Initially, she convinced herself that it couldn't have happened because of them, but now she had significant doubts. The brothers had too flashy an appearance, creating the illusion of wealthy young people. After a couple of weeks of dating, they concocted a ridiculous story about being fired from the bank. Practically forced the girls to let them live with them, claiming they were waiting for something and would return to luxury later. Another oddity was the need to keep information about Cynthia's marriage a secret. Just a week after moving in with her, Michael stated he would have to return to Germany if they did not marry soon, as he would be deported. This provided the reason for such a hasty and secret wedding ceremony in Las Vegas, painting a more sinister and plausible picture. It seemed that, taking advantage of Cynthia's feelings, Michael forced his new girlfriend into marriage. Detectives tried to track down the brothers' history and were able to find several women they had met after arriving from Germany. It turned out that Cynthia was not the only one they had proposed marriage to. While it seemed that everything was going well for Cynthia and Michael compared to previous attempts, their very existence appeared suspicious. When Cynthia's diary was found, the last entry was dated November 11th. It sounded like Cynthia trying to convince herself of her husband's sincerity. No evidence was found that could connect the brothers or other acquaintances in the victim's close circle. Detectives even discovered a car rented on the day of Cynthia's death, but the tire prints did not match the tread pattern found at the crime scene. The interior of the brothers' car was also checked with analysis, but this yielded nothing. Unexpectedly, on January 3rd, Michael contacted the only German-speaking detective and reported that, after returning to the apartment following his wife's funeral, he had heard a suspicious message on the answering machine. Michael believed it contained some kind of threat but could not fully translate it, so he asked the officer for help. On January 4th, he came to the police station with the recording. It turned out that someone had indeed threatened to kill all his loved ones and himself if certain items were not received. The caller confessed to cutting Cynthia's throat with a knife, but it was unclear what items were being discussed. Detectives immediately noticed that the words were pronounced with errors and seemed feigned, as if the person was reading from a script. The text contained distortions that were uncharacteristic of English, and when it was literally translated into German, the text sounded much more coherent. The detectives feigned concern, but suspicions against Michael, Rudy, Annette began to emerge and strengthen. Where this group lived, 24-hour surveillance was in place. On January 5th, police officers monitoring the apartment complex observed them at 5:30 p.m. At 8:30 p.m., a secret agent knocked on the door. The law enforcement officer was in civilian clothes and pretended to have the wrong door. In fact, he wanted to confirm who was in the apartment and ensured that they were suspects. Interestingly, immediately after this visit, Michael reported that two black individuals had threatened him on his doorstep. He was not caught in a lie. Instead, they were invited to the station the next day to create a composite sketch of these fictitious dark-skinned men. Michael was interrogated for several hours while the rest of his group waited. The detectives deliberately prolonged the process and closely observed them to see the first signs that the criminal's will was beginning to break. Annette was the first to give in. Although she did not confess for quite some time, one of the detectives began showing her photos of the mutilated victims. Michael and Rudy were seeking citizenship, so Annette was involved to maintain communication since the brothers practically did not speak English, only Michael could communicate somewhat. They tried several schemes to introduce themselves, either as manufacturers of surfboards or as importers of German cars. According to the same story, they met Cynthia. For several months, they lived in a cheap motel, deceiving many women who succumbed to their looks and charm as man escort. This allowed them to receive money from these women for a living, but they were waiting for something more. Annette did not admit to the murder or even that it was planned. However, it was clear that her relationship with Cynthia had been based solely on a desire for profit. After they began living together and got married, Cynthia worked 2 jobs while Michael spent money recklessly, claiming he was waiting for the unblocking of accounts in Germany. From October to December, he managed to spend more than $4,000 from his girlfriend's wallet. After obtaining this confession, the detectives pressured Annette, threatening that she would be charged with murder if she did not tell the truth. She confessed that Michael had developed a taste for the good life and wanted more money, after which he devised a larger plan. On November 7th, he convinced his wife Cynthia to contact an insurance agent and take out life insurance policies for $1 million on each other. The beneficiary of her policy was, of course, Michael. He continued to feed her false statements, saying that their accounts in Germany were frozen, but that he would soon have access to them, making life insurance essential for them. Cynthia blindly trusted her husband due to her feelings. The insurance agent approved the policy, but it was not for $1 million, it was for $400,000. Without hesitation, Cynthia wrote out a check. After that, the brothers began to plan their expenses in anticipation of receiving the money. They even drew up a purchase and sale agreement for 2 Jaguar cars worth $144,000 each and 2 Toyota cars, each worth $66,000. They were also looking for expensive items, fully aware that in order to obtain all this luxury, they would have to kill. Cynthia's life insurance policy went into effect just a day before her death, and the insurance amount was even increased to $800,000. By this time, the brothers had already rented a car in which they planned to take Cynthia to the desert and kill her. On the day of the crime, Michael and Rudy took Cynthia to the desert, then lured her out of the car and brutally handled her. Annette was even in the car. According to her, it took the brothers about 5 minutes to stab the innocent victim. When they returned, both were covered in blood from head to toe. They changed their clothes and washed the blood off their skin to avoid staining the car. After getting rid of all the evidence, they returned the rented car and went to a luxury restaurant to celebrate their victory. Everything seemed to go according to plan, and it was supposed to be the perfect murder that promised great riches, except that Cynthia's body was quickly found. The plan began to crumble before their eyes. Was Cynthia their first murder victim? To answer these questions, detectives contacted colleagues in Germany to uncover the truth about the brothers' dark past. They found that Michael did not have any blocked accounts containing large sums of money, nor did he own any estate in Germany. In reality, he was a laborer with a criminal past that included convictions for burglary and assault. His brother Rudy had served time in a German prison for abuse. Due to their criminal history, connections to other possible crimes in the USA could not be found, indicating that perhaps Cynthia was their first and only victim. There was only one perplexing question left. Why did the tire tracks of the car used to transport the victim not match the tracks that were found? It turned out that Michael had anticipated this. On the day of the tragedy, he drove in such a way that it damaged the tread on the tires. When he returned the rented car, the tires had to be replaced. The person who provided the car for rent helped the police realize that it was true. In order to leave sinister messages with threats, they used a random homeless man on the streets of Los Angeles. After Cynthia's funeral, he was paid to call the specified phone number and read a text from a sheet. Annette was offered immunity from prosecution in exchange for testifying against Michael and Rudy. She agreed. A thorough search was conducted of the apartment where Cynthia and Michael lived, leading to the discovery of a pair of shoes whose soles matched the footprints found at the crime scene, which confirmed Michael and Rudy's guilt. During the imprisonment of the individual involved, notes containing incriminating information were found and used against them. At the trial, the most reckless act was Michael's decision to speak in his own defense. Even his lawyers tried to dissuade him, but to no avail. He thought he was smarter than everyone else. His confidence worked against him, as he made several contradictory confessions that only convinced the jury of his guilt. Michael and Rudy made a desperate attempt to shift the blame onto Annette, but this also failed. August 10, 1990, the jury found Michael Apelt and Rudy Alfred Apelt guilty of first-degree murder. Both brothers were sentenced to death. However, in 2009, Rudy's sentence was overturned because an IQ test showed that he was mentally disabled. His sentence was commuted to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole. After 25 years, Rudy applied for parole in 2017. At the commission meeting, a letter was read from Kathy, who recalled that it was Rudy who inflicted most of the knife wounds on Cynthia and slit her throat. Kathy was convinced that such a man was dangerous and should not be released. As a result, his petition was denied. On April 26, 2022, 52-year-old Rudy died behind bars. Michael's sentence has not changed. He remains on death row awaiting execution. His defense is deliberately delaying the execution appeal, prolonging his life. Cynthia's death was so devastating that it prevented Kathy from trusting men and people in general. She did not marry until she was 50 years old. The murder of Cynthia Monkman cannot be called a crime of passion. It was a cold calculation by sociopaths for whom human life became merely a tool for achieving material goals. Insurance companies, in their attempt to increase profits by selling high-value policies, unwittingly created the conditions for murder by providing the criminals with a financial motive. Evidence indicates that the Apelt brothers would not have killed Cynthia if her life had not been insured. They probably would have turned their attention to another victim. Hello everyone, today we will learn about another case. The case of Megan Carr and Cherish DeSantis. In 1992, in the small town of Thomasville, Georgia, USA, best friends Megan Carr and Cherish DeSantis were studying together. Both were born in 1975, just one day apart. They considered it a real providence that determined they would be best friends since childhood. Both lived with their families in this quiet, calm town. They came from wealthy families. Megan's father owned a well drilling company that had been in the family since the 1940s. Megan's parents were divorced, so she lived with her mother, Shirley. Cherish's father, Peter, was involved in the tobacco industry and owned a tobacco business that had been running for 2 decades. Cherish and Megan met in elementary school, where they became very close friends and spent their free time together. They had a lot in common, and their families had similar income levels. At 16, Cherish was in a relationship with a boy. They had been close friends since elementary school and were part of a privileged group of teenagers who owned their own cars. This made them popular at school. Megan's mother raised her daughter alone and was a bit stricter. Megan was very creative, performing with her group in the school orchestra and choreographing productions. Overall, they were typical teenagers who loved to have fun, attend parties, and confide in each other. In spring, they looked forward to the upcoming holidays. The last day of classes was March 26, 1992. The teachers were preparing for spring break, which would last until April 6. Since Thomasville was close to the Florida border, it was the perfect opportunity for teenagers to drive to the coast for sunbathing and swimming. On March 27, 1992, the girls planned to visit their favorite beach on the Alligator Point Peninsula on the Gulf Coast, a little-known area that was always quiet and peaceful. They intended to leave around noon and return home later that evening. The previous Thursday, Megan and Cherish had spent the night at Cherish's boyfriend's place, Alex, preparing beach bags for the trip. On Friday morning, they left around 10 a.m. A few friends were supposed to join them, but at the last moment, they all declined, so the two friends set out alone. Along the way, they made 3 stops, first, at a store to buy food, then at a Florida souvenir shop, and finally, they had a snack at a diner. Around noon, they arrived at the beach, parked, and enjoyed the music while swimming and chatting. Everything seemed perfectly fine. A local policeman and his wife were walking along the beach on his day off. Noticing the girls, they decided not to disturb them and moved to a distance out of their sight. However, the policeman's wife noticed that the girls appeared to be lying on top of each other, which seemed strange, but they did not intervene immediately. Some time later, as the couple was preparing to leave, they passed by the rocky ledge and noticed the girls still hadn't moved at all. Concerned, the experienced policeman took a closer look and realized that something unusual. He instructed his wife to stay put while he went to check on them. When he approached, he saw that the girls were not displaying any signs of life. Their bodies were covered in blood, as were the things around them. Since they didn't have cell phones at that time, the policeman rushed to the nearest phone to inform the county sheriff about the incident. At about 3 p.m., the dispatcher received the call. The incident shocked law enforcement and residents alike, as nothing like this had happened in the area since 1966. The crime rate was almost zero. When the police arrived at the secluded beach, they confirmed the presence of the bodies of the 2 girls. All their belongings, including wallets with cash and identification cards, were intact, ruling out robbery. The music was still playing in the car, and the keys were lying next to the bodies. It was a chilling scene. The girls' swimsuits had not been removed or torn, making abuse assault unlikely. Megan had a towel soaked in blood on her head, and both girls had 2 gunshot wounds to the head, indicating that the attack was unexpected, as there were no signs of struggle on the beach. Authorities began searching for anyone who might have witnessed the attack or heard gunshots. However, an inspection of the surrounding area didn't yield any new leads until communication with local detectives revealed a young man who frequented the beach. He mentioned that around 12:30 that same day, he heard a noise resembling fireworks. It was likely that these were gunshots. After that, he saw a car leaving the beach that was unfamiliar to him. Presumably, it was a blue Plymouth Volare. Right away, they found strangers in the parking lot near Megan's car. It did not resemble the one described by the witness. A girl was still playing music, and behind the car, there was a guy who was looking through something on his camera. The detectives decided that this guy could be connected to the tragedy and considered the possibility that the witness had incorrectly identified the make of the car, as the color matched. They approached him, and he introduced himself as a local photographer, stating that he had spent the whole day on the beach taking pictures of wildlife. He claimed that he must have known something about the teenagers since he had been nearby, but surprisingly, he said he didn't see or hear anything suspicious. This seemed odd, so one of the police officers decided to check him using one of their usual tactics. This random motorist was the only suspect at that moment. The detective ironically suggested that the guy could have been filming not only birds but also girls who had come to relax on the beach. In response, the guy took an aggressive defensive position, which looked even more suspicious. This gave the detectives grounds to search the guy's car. When they searched the glove compartment of his car, they found a gun. By evening, the young man tried to negotiate with the police to let him go, insisting that he had done nothing wrong and did not understand what they wanted from him. However, the suspect was detained and taken to the police station. Meanwhile, Megan and Cherish's parents had not yet learned of what had happened. They were very worried about their daughters. Around 6 p.m., Megan's mother could not stand it any longer and decided to go to Cherish's house to check on her daughter, but the girls were not there. Both families were worried, as their daughters had not returned and were not aware that authorities were preparing to inform them about the tragic incident at the beach. Naturally, this was devastating for both the Carr family and the DeSantis family. The parents tried to assist the police in any way possible, mentioning that Megan and Cherish spent most of their time together, had no other teenagers in their company. They maintained constant contact with a couple of girls and a guy named Alex. However, she immediately emphasized that the young man did not seem like an aggressor capable of violence and refused to believe it. Detectives were convinced that the assailant knew the victims and was likely following them. They struggled to understand how a stranger with a weapon could get so close to Megan and Cherish without arousing their suspicions. Megan and Cherish had to remain vigilant, as the killer managed to get close enough to attack both girls almost instantly. Thus, detectives carefully checked and analyzed the immediate circle of the victims. Meanwhile, the detained photographer was interrogated at the police station. He admitted to having seen the girls on the beach but insisted they were alive when he passed by, photographing the scenery. His apparent disinterest in them only increased suspicions against him. The police offered him a polygraph test, which he agreed to, and he passed easily. Additionally, the gun found in a glove compartment did not match the murder weapon. It seemed he was telling the truth, and he was subsequently released. According to the medical examiner's conclusions, both teenagers were attacked in the head at very close range with an 8-gauge weapon, and no other signs of injury or assault were found. Consequently, the motive for the crime remained unclear. The very next morning, news of the double murder on a secluded Florida beach was broadcast across all media channels in both Florida and Georgia. Authorities called on any witnesses who might have seen something to contact them. Among those who reached out was a woman who had moved to Gator Point 2 weeks prior. She spoke negatively about the area, deeming it unsafe. Upon learning that 2 girls went there alone without any escorts or dogs, she labeled them as too frivolous. She claimed there were several witnesses who saw the schoolgirls that morning and afternoon, but no one witnessed the moment of the attack or saw the suspects or the victims lying bloody on each other until a police officer and his wife were walking along the beach. Detectives then became interested in a man, the owner of a small cafe located just a couple of 100 meters from the shore. Megan and Cherish could have stopped by the cafe while heading to the parking lot. According to the police, he should have known and heard the moment of the attack. However, the man denied this, stating that he and his employees were busy with repairs in the bar that day. The noise from tools and hammers being used drowned out any gunshots. The high school girls had chosen a peculiar location to spend their time, as it was one of the most isolated areas along the coast, according to him. They could have learned about this secluded place from someone else, or perhaps they had been here many times themselves and sought out secluded spots. This section of the beach was exclusively visited by locals, and this detail could have become an important clue in the search for the criminal. The bartender said he remembered something unusual. Sometime after noon on the day of the murder, a man had entered and asked for a Bloody Mary. The problem was that renovations were taking place, and it took longer than usual to prepare the drink. The bartender apologized for the inconvenience and offered a drink on the house, but the stranger insisted that the owner take his money, stating it was his first and last time there. The next suspicious character was Alex. It was with him that Megan and Cherish had spent the night before the trip. After relaxing on the beach, they planned to visit him again. There was an assumption that he had gone to the beach with Megan and Cherish and could have harmed them there. This information should have been checked right from the beginning of the police investigation. He appeared heartbroken. He simply could not believe that her girlfriend and best friend had died. They communicated regularly and a lot. He denied any suspicion of involvement in the crime but mentioned something unusual. He stated that he did not own a gun. However, the police had not yet disclosed that Megan and Cherish were shot dead. Although he could have seen this information on television or heard it from someone else. He provided his alibi, which was confirmed by his employer. He was working on the day of the trip. Consequently, he was quickly ruled out as a suspect. The families of the victims, feeling helpless, did everything possible to find the criminal. Megan and Cherish's relatives even offered a reward for any information that would help find the killer, but this did not significantly motivate the public to share anything. Both schoolgirls were buried on March 30th. The fathers, who were businessmen, even began to speculate that some ill-wishers or competitors could have harmed their children. It was troubling that two girls from different families had been killed simultaneously. At least one of them would likely have had nothing to do with the attack. Several weeks passed, and all of the obvious leads for the police turned out to be dead ends. The authorities had neither a motive nor evidence nor a murder weapon. The only lead they hadn't fully checked yet was the blue Plymouth Volare car in which an unknown person had left the beach during the time frame of the attack. They began checking all the owners of such cars in the area. Detectives even encountered a hardened criminal who had recently been released from prison. The man had 13 arrests on his record and, despite being only 28 years old, lived across the street from Cherish and owned a similar vehicle. However, this lead also did not lead to anything. They even attempted to search for smugglers who might have been operating on that secluded beach, perhaps delivering a large shipment of illegal substances, and when confronted by random witnesses, they decided to eliminate them. On May 15, 1992, at about 10 a.m., a call came into the Franklin County Sheriff's Office. On the other end of the line was a frightened woman, who stated that the girls had been killed by her ex-partner. This statement was treated with skepticism, as officials believed she was seeking her moment of fame or revenge. However, according to her, her ex had confessed to the massacre. She was not afraid to give her name and was willing to meet with detectives. The caller insisted that the man had just called her and that she could not stay in the country. The killer was identified as Robert Neal. It turned out that this man had already been on the list of suspects in the early stages of the investigation but had been cleared due to his status as a former police officer. When the woman named the model of the new suspect's vehicle, it turned out to be very similar to a Plymouth Volare. She also stated that he had left town after these events and did not know exactly where he had gone. The witness indicated the last address where he had lived with his mother, which was about an hour's drive from Alligator Point. She learned that her boyfriend had a gun, but she did not know the caliber of the weapon. After seeing Robert's picture, the bartender realized he was the man who tried to pay for the offered cocktail. All this information seemed interesting, and neighboring states began to distribute the description of the man, who was wanted. At one time, he had been a police officer in Portland, Oregon, where he had worked for many years. Thanks to access to the suspect's personal file, investigators received new information on the address where Robert lived with his mother, but he was not found. In addition, she had died shortly before these events, preventing further investigation. Robert changed schools 7 times due to moves related to his father's military career. After graduating from school, he went to university and even took up religion, ultimately becoming a Mormon missionary who worked in Guatemala before returning to the United States. He received a law degree and then became a police officer. Until his retirement, he had no problems with the law, no disciplinary actions, and a perfect service record. However, he also had a dark side. His ex-wife reported that he was addicted to illegal substances, which led to their breakup. Over time, Robert's life deteriorated. He changed many jobs and, by 1992, had gone bankrupt and was working as a cleaner in a local church. Detectives were frantically trying to figure out where to look for Robert, fearing that the only clue had already been missed. However, a few hours after speaking with his ex-wife, Robert himself called the Franklin County Police Station, introduced himself, and confessed to the double murder at Alligator Point. He stated he was calling from a phone booth on a New Mexico highway, having been traveling for 4 days from Florida. Information about him was immediately made public because even over the phone, it was clear he was in a depressed state. The police feared he might take his own life, and they tried to keep him on the line. Unfortunately, Robert did not call to surrender. Instead, he headed to the Grand Canyon, where he intended to take his own life. The police had little time left since the drive from where he was supposedly located to the Grand took about 6 hours. The investigation revealed that as early as 1987, Robert had started experiencing mental health issues. It seemed that 2 personalities lived inside him, resulting in a constant struggle between good and evil. Sometimes, the dark side took control, leading him into severe depression and thoughts of taking his own life. This situation required regular intake of a certain antidepressant. The next morning, on May 16, 1992, police stations received another call from New Mexico. A witness had found a blue car, inside of which sat a man with no signs of life. He was identified as 42-year-old Robert Neo Rodriguez. The car had Utah license plates that had been stolen less than a week earlier from a roadside motel parking lot. This allowed the criminal to carry out his plans without being captured by the police. On Robert's neck was a bottle containing some white powder, and in the glove compartment was a note stating that he of the car had been poisoned by cyanide. It emphasized that, under no circumstances, should anyone attempt to resuscitate him through mouth-to-mouth breathing, as this could endanger the lives of the rescuers. The note also indicated that he had sent a letter to one of the detectives conducting the investigation, detailing what had happened and confessing to the crime. The killer was found, and the immediate threat had passed. Robert's mother died on Easter Sunday, April 19, 1992, in a nursing home. Before that, his brother had died, and then his father. After the death of his mother, Robert had no living relatives, except for his half-sister. After that, he went to Tampa to see her to say goodbye. During this time, he called his ex from a payphone, complaining that he was running out of money and gas. He admitted that he didn't know why he had killed 2 girls. He said he was going to make sure he could never hurt anyone again but did not provide any details. After that, a frightened woman called the police station and told them everything. During searches of Robert's house, numerous books and records were found, all of which contained references to the topic of death. He had been struggling with psychological problems for a long time but couldn't control them. Megan and Cherish could not be the first victims of a sick person. By this time, his career growth had completely stalled, and the only source of income was cleaning the local church, which he did regularly. The local community knew Robert as a harmless, kind, caring person. People were amazed that such different personalities could coexist in his mind without revealing themselves for years. In his letter, he admitted that the loving atmosphere of the church probably contributed to him committing a lesser crime than he could have actually committed. 42-year-old Robert sent numerous letters before his death, the first of which was sent to a journalist. He claimed he was wanted for 3 murders in Florida. He admitted to killing Valerie Hunt, a student at Tallahassee Community College, who went missing during summer vacation after visiting a shopping mall in 1984. Valerie's body was found that same year in September. At that time, the case was sent to the cold case file due to a lack of information during the search for the student, as her body was badly decomposed. Forensic experts struggled to determine the cause of death. Valerie was described as a friendly girl, so her death was a real shock. It was probably his first crime, and he also could not explain it. On May 15th, a letter came for the same detective who was working on the Megan and Cherish case. Unlike the first letter, which was only 1 page, this one had 6 pages. However, there were no indications of other victims. Robert focused solely on 3 victims and provided the police with about 60 clues that needed to be checked. Later, Robert's relatives and ex-wives received letters of repentance, along with letters sent to the families of all 3 victims. The killer began the story by stating that these records should be regarded as evidence for the investigation and they should be transferred to the appropriate authorities. Apparently, these acts of aggression were not motivated by anything. He simply wanted to experience the feeling that comes with killing a defenseless person. This revelation sounded terrifying and sparked anger among the parents of the victims. Everything was sent out, and 11 letters from Robert were published, all carefully studied by detectives. Robert emphasized that after the crime in 1984, he somehow managed to convince himself that he was not involved in the death of Valerie Hunt. However, the pain he had managed to contain within himself all these years came flooding back with renewed vigor when he pulled the trigger again, killing Megan and Cherish. The families of the victims were left with nothing but anger, believing the killer deserved imprisonment. The investigative bodies carefully analyzed his letters and concluded that the case was closed due to the criminal's confession. Besides, all evidence, including samples of Robert's DNA, was collected, archived in case it needed to be analyzed and compared with other criminal episodes. There was still a possibility that there could have been many more victims of his crimes. Welcome back, detectives. Let's dive into another horrible case. The case of Kathleen Shepard. Kathleen Shepard and her friend Detsy Hughes grew up across the street from each other in the small town of Dayton, Iowa, which has a population of less than 1,000 people. In this quiet town, everyone knows one another. Kathleen was 3 years older than Detsy. In 2013, she was 15, while Detsy was 12. Despite the age difference, they were best friends and did everything together, often walking home from the school bus stop. At approximately 4 p.m. on May 20, 2013, after being dropped off by the bus, they noticed that a red pickup truck was following them. The man in the truck caught their attention by offering them a chance to earn some pocket money. He said he owned a lawn care business and needed help. Although he was a little skeptical about their lawn mowing abilities, he was so convincing that they began to trust him. The man said he could drive them home to get ready, then they would go to work together, and he would pay them right away. However, when they got in the car, he changed his plans. Instead of taking them home, he drove them out of town. When Kathleen and Detsy sensed something was wrong and tried to resist, the man pulled out a weapon and threatened to kill them if they didn't comply. He took them to an old, abandoned house and brought them to a dilapidated barn that hadn't been used for years. He tied them up, threw them face down in the dirt, and warned them that if they obeyed him, they wouldn't be harmed and he would eventually let them go, even offering to give them a ride back to town. At that moment, Detsy realized something was very wrong. First, if he's not planning to kill them, why go so far from the city? Second, the presence of a weapon suggested otherwise from the beginning. Kathleen's last words were, "They don't deserve this." After that, the kidnapper took her into the woods, giving Detsy a chance to escape. Detsy couldn't explain why Kathleen was taken or what happened to Kathleen since she didn't witness it. Although the kidnapper threatened them with a weapon, he was so careless that he left it right in front of Detsy while taking Kathleen away. Detsy was able to loosen her ropes and escape. While fleeing, she grabbed a weapon for protection in case he tried to catch her. Scared, she navigated through the forest, avoiding thorny roots, and then followed a dirt road in search of help. There were no people around. Despite her injuries, Detsy did not give in to the pain. She felt as though the kidnapper was still pursuing her and that escape was impossible. In her desperate situation, she called out for help, and people nearby brought her to the police. Detsy was terrified. During her escape, she had lost her shoes and sustained several cuts on her legs and feet, which were bloody but not life-threatening. While her physical injuries healed quickly, the emotional scars lingered. Although she received rehabilitation, she still struggles with the psychological effects from the traumatic experience. Detsy provided a detailed description of the kidnapper and his car, giving detectives a solid chance of locating him before he could harm anyone else. Later that evening, around 8 p.m., a body was discovered in the countryside, near the area where Detsy was rescued, at a country estate northeast of Dayton, Iowa. The deceased was identified as 42-year-old Michael Klunder, who Detsy later recognized as her kidnapper. Interestingly, the cause of his death was not revealed for some time. The situation was confusing because Michael did not leave any suicide notes, and there were no clues about where to search for Kathleen. The police had to conduct the search for her without clear leads. Detectives investigated Michael's background for possible clues and found some information. He had his first trial in 1989 when he was just 17 years old and was from Mason City, Iowa, USA. On February 22, 1989, Michael knocked on Jill Gilsey's door, claiming that his car had broken down and asking to use her phone. Instead of just helping him, Jill offered to give him a ride home so he could deal with his car issues. He accepted her offer immediately without any hesitation. As soon as Jill opened the door, he attacked her, knocking her down, hitting her several times, and trying to strangle her with his bare hands. Despite the brutal attack and severe bruising on her neck, Jill fought back and, with the last of her strength, pushed him away. She was determined to seek justice for this horrific incident. Michael faced charges for second-degree burglary and assault with intent to cause serious injury, both of which were aggravated offenses. However, after his arrest, a judge decided to set a bail amount that was below the maximum for those charges, allowing him the potential to be released. This leniency angered Jill and others, as it seemed the judge underestimated the severity of his actions. Fortunately, Michael could not afford the bail, so he remained in custody. Michael remains in custody, awaiting his sentencing hearing. Jill and many others who know Michael believe he is not receiving the punishment he deserves, which worries them. During the preliminary hearing, a decision was made regarding whether Michael, the 17-year-old, should be tried as an adult or as a juvenile. The juvenile judge chose to recuse himself because Michael Klunder displayed alarming behavior from the start. He had a history of being problematic and aggressive, particularly toward girls. In November of that year, Michael enticed a classmate into the school restroom. He threatened her with a weapon and demanded that she take off her shirt, but the girl resisted and tried to escape from him. In response, he struck her on the head with a metal object and physically assaulted her. This resulted in serious injuries, and the girl spent about a week recovering in the hospital. By February 1989, it was reported that Michael had been released after fulfilling all court orders following the incident with the girl in the restroom. Michael returned to live with his father and stepmother in Mason City. However, he soon began to have aggressive outbursts. Shortly after, he attacked a girl named Jill and was arrested. While in custody, officials advised against allowing him to interact with older inmates due to concerns that he might either act aggressively or be bullied because of the charges against him. However, his skills as a liar and manipulator posed a risk of negatively influencing other young offenders. Facing serious charges, he could be sentenced to up to 12 years in prison and fined up to $15,000. If he had been tried as a minor, he would have faced a maximum of 7 years. This situation provided his lawyer with both a clear goal and leverage. On March 30th, Michael pleaded guilty to attempted burglary and attempted assault with intent to cause serious harm. Just 5 weeks before his 18th birthday, he learned his sentence. Michael was taken to the mental health center in Cherokee for a psychiatric evaluation. While imprisoned, he was sentenced to 5 years for attacking Jill. He spent his 18th birthday in prison and received an additional 2 years for robbery. However, these sentences were to run concurrently, meaning he would still be released after 5 years. This news troubled Jill, but there was nothing she could do about it. The court had decided that extending his sentence would be inhumane, likely hoping he could be rehabilitated despite being a potentially dangerous criminal. Despite the short sentence, Michael's lawyers sought to have it reduced. Their main argument was that he was still a minor, even though he was tried as an adult. Fortunately, in September 1989, the court refused to modify its ruling. 2 years passed, and he completed his sentence for robbery, but he still had 3 years remaining for the charges of bodily harm and assault before his official release. Michael adhered to all court orders and took part in a rehabilitation program for individuals at risk of committing abuse. He took the program seriously and attended all the lectures, but it seemed unlikely that he genuinely wanted to change his behavior. His lawyer approached the case with determination, believing that Michael was ready for release. Michael had a flawless prison record, with no incidents or fights during his incarceration, which worked in his favor. Michael's defenders succeeded in getting his case reviewed, resulting in his release in 1991, shortly after his 20th birthday. However, he was placed on probation. From the start, it became clear that his old habits were resurfacing. In 1992, 2 young girls, both just 3 years old, disappeared near Michael's home while playing in a sandbox. Their parents quickly realized the girls had been abducted and reported it to the police, prompting an immediate search, fearing the worst. An unknown caller contacted the police station, reporting that the 2 missing girls had been found at a bus stop nearly 100 kilometers from their hometown. A passerby noticed a small orange container under a canopy at the bus stop. Upon opening it, he was startled by what he discovered and promptly alerted the authorities. When officers arrived, they found the girls, who were both injured. Though several witnesses had identified Michael as a suspect, he had not yet been charged. One witness recalled seeing him observe young girls from his window, spending extended periods in his kitchen or living room watching as children played outside or as schoolgirls returned home. In light of the girls' abduction, this behavior raised alarm. The day after the girls were located, police visited Michael's home to question him. However, at that time, detectives lacked sufficient evidence. They faced a challenge in gathering information about the kidnappers from the 3-year-old victims without causing further trauma. Due to their young age and fear, the girls were unable to provide meaningful details. After an initial conversation, detectives still had no valuable information. Michael denied any involvement in the kidnapping, and without evidence, the police had no basis to detain him. Michael took advantage of the delay, got into his 1982 Honda, and left the state, heading to Florida. However, his getaway was cut short when the car broke down on the road. This forced him to seek help from a relative who lived nearby. Eventually, Michael was arrested on Christmas Eve. The arrest occurred at a bus stop in Houston, thanks to an anonymous tip received by law enforcement. It turned out that the call had come from Michael's relative, who suspected that he was up to something, even though they had no knowledge of the situation involving the kidnapped girls. The 3-year-old victims lived in the same residential complex in Cherokee, where the troubling events had taken place. Despite appearing to be a safe place under surveillance, it seems he had been watching the girls for a while before realizing they were alone. CCTV footage from the complex showed the girls playing before they suddenly looked away and moved in another direction. Detectives believe Michael managed to attract their attention while remaining out of sight of the cameras. This plan worked. The girls' miraculous rescue was even covered on television. Michael had hidden them in a container, which he sealed and left at the bus stop. If the box hadn't been discovered within a few hours, the outcome could have been very different. It was a fortunate coincidence, along with the vigilance of a passerby, that led to their rescue. Doctors reported that while the children had not been abused, they did have injuries. One showed visible signs of strangulation around her neck. The other girl could have suffered the same fate, but for unknown reasons, the criminals seemed less focused on her. In a frightened, fragmented manner, the girl described how a large man had grabbed her neck, making it hard for her to breathe. Fortunately, something caused him to stop. This miraculous rescue also helped police gather crucial information. Initially, the girls were too scared to talk freely to detectives, but over time, they revealed that the criminal had attempted to strangle both of them when he took them away to a remote location. Witnesses had a clear memory of the attacker and provided a description that closely resembled Michael Klunder. Following this, he was arrested and charged with kidnapping and harming children. In Iowa, kidnapping can result in a life sentence, and his previous criminal history raised concerns. Michael was genuinely shocked when detectives returned to his home to read him his rights. During the hearing, his lawyer argued for a lighter sentence. Michael was convicted of third-degree kidnapping, but the assault charge was reduced since no one died in the incident and the choking was considered less severe. He received a 2-year sentence for causing bodily harm and a 10-year sentence for each count of third-degree kidnapping. The jury reached their verdict quickly. By the time he was incarcerated, another crime had been solved just 5 months later, revealing that he had also been involved in other kidnapping incidents that he had not disclosed. Fortunately, those incidents did not lead to any fatalities. Ultimately, the court sentenced him to over 30 years in prison, to be served consecutively, with no possibility of parole. His lawyer continued to argue that instead of prison, Michael needed rehabilitation and support for reintegration into society. There was some merit to this argument, as Michael's behavior during his first arrest was concerning. He appeared detached and indifferent when speaking with police. After Michael confessed, he was asked why he felt it was necessary to kidnap his victims. He couldn't provide a solid explanation and later claimed it was due to having a bad day. It's unclear what behaviors might lead to leniency in prison, but Michael was released in 2011 after serving only 20 years. However, this was followed by another probation period, which he failed to complete. Before he could fully adjust to being free, he began to act out again, leading to a more tragic outcome. This time, Michael kidnapped Kathleen and Detsy. Detsy was rescued by accident, but the search for Kathleen continues. This incident increased the total number of confirmed victims of Michael to 7, most of whom were minors. However, the actual number could be greater. In 1992, Michael lived in another state where he committed additional crimes, including the kidnapping of an 18-year-old girl named Lori Lee Smith, whom he lured with his car. At the time, Lori was driving home on a quiet country road late at night. Suddenly, she noticed someone behind her flashing their headlights and signaling her to stop. Believing it was an emergency, Lori pulled over and rolled down her window. Michael then approached her vehicle, claiming that her taillights were out and offering to help check them. Unaware of the danger, Lori got out of her car. As soon as Lori reached the side of the trunk, Michael pulled out a knife and threatened her. He tried to lure her into his car, but Lori was brave and fiercely resisted him. They struggled inside Michael's vehicle until a passing truck interrupted them. It's important to note that Michael typically kept his victims alive until the last moment, with the exception of Kathleen. After Michael was released in 2011 and before he kidnapped Kathleen and Detsy in 2013, there was a significant period during which his actions went unaccounted for. This gap raised concerns and warranted further investigation to determine if there were other victims or crimes that had not yet been discovered. During this time, Michael had plenty of opportunities to commit more crimes, and there were few signs that he intended to change his ways. It was believed that he could have committed many similar offenses, some of which might have resulted in deaths. His victims were often saved by sheer luck or unexpected circumstances. There could be other unresolved kidnappings and murders linked to him. For example, he was suspected of being involved in the disappearances of 2 8-year-old girls in 2012, Leary Cook Morrissey and Elizabeth Collins from Evansdale, Iowa. However, proving a connection to these cases was not possible. At the time of Leary and Elizabeth's observation, Michael's phone was detected in a different location, which cleared him of suspicion. This case remains unsolved, and the fate of 15-year-old Kathleen is still uncertain. Detectives are analyzing the information and investigating the final days of Michael's life. Interestingly, he appeared to be maintaining a normal life. He had a steady job, purchased a house, and was married to a woman named Lisa, who also came from a small town. Michael preferred small towns because children there tend to be more trusting, many homes are often left unlocked, and it can be easier for criminals to operate. Michael was fortunate not only in finding victims but also in eluding detection. Even though he should have been registered as an abuse offender and was under constant watch by the authorities, Lisa was completely unaware of his past. As a result, detectives decided to search their home first. On February 25, 2013, law enforcement officers spoke with neighbors to see if anyone had seen Kathleen, but no one recognized her photo. Lisa, who listened in shock to the revelations from the police about her husband, felt overwhelmed and was unable to provide any useful information to the investigator. Around this time, 12-year-old Detsy had regained her composure. She spoke with the detectives and later participated in several interviews, which helped them piece together the details of her escape. Detectives searched the barn but did not find Kathleen there. Hopes for her safe return quickly faded when bloodstains found in Michael's car were matched to her DNA. The circumstances surrounding Kathleen remained unclear, but they were able to make some predictions about Michael's behavior. When he returned and discovered that Detsy had escaped and taken his weapon with her, he concluded that it was all over for him and took his own life. Michael likely feared returning to prison, knowing that other inmates would have treated him terribly for his crimes against children. Something terrible must have happened to Kathleen, leading him to choose death over life in prison. Even after Detsy's escape, there were still no updates about Kathleen. The search continued, and in those initial days, they discovered the girl's backpacks, which Michael had left behind in the forest. Kathleen Shepard's fate was discovered 2 weeks later when a body was found in the river, a few kilometers from her hometown. Unfortunately, her body's condition had deteriorated, making identification difficult. Eventually, it was confirmed that the body belonged to Kathleen Shepard. Investigators found signs of sharp objects on her body and the same bindings used to restrain Detsy. In this way, Kathleen became Michael's last victim. This situation raises questions regarding Michael as an individual. In light of these events, the public expressed outrage towards law enforcement, accusing them of protecting dangerous criminals more than the victims. Interestingly, Lisa, Michael's wife, was one of the few who genuinely mourned him. Could she have been the only person to see some humanity in him that could inspire affection? Or was her seeming affection a result of her husband's manipulative behavior? Hello, crime enthusiasts. Are you ready for another chilling investigation? The case of Sandra Rozzo. Sandra Rozzo was a friendly and optimistic woman who always persevered. She lives in the town of Palace Park in Florida, USA, and aspires to build a career in the film and modeling industry. Anyone who has met her once realizes that she possesses all the qualities necessary to achieve this goal: an attractive appearance, a well-proportioned body, and charisma. Sandra began her modeling journey during her school years. She was actively involved in sports, particularly weightlifting, maintained her figure, and always dressed impeccably. During the day, she searched for modeling jobs, while at night, she worked as a bartender in a nightclub in Tampa, where she lived with her family. Sandra had always wanted to create a family and form meaningful relationships. Her attractive appearance draws the attention of many people, but finding the right partner is not easy. She set high standards, making it difficult for anyone to meet her expectations. At 37, she was divorced and living with her teenage daughter, Giovanna. She maintained a friendly relationship with her ex-husband and shared custody of their daughter. However, she is not willing to lower her standards in her search for happiness. Eventually, she met Timothy Alvin Tracy Humphrey, a tall and athletic man who stood nearly 190 centimeters tall. He claimed to have been a lingerie model and a professional football player. Among his friends, Timothy was known as an exceptional sports trainer. It was no surprise that he worked at a fitness center, where he was very popular with clients, particularly women who were drawn to his classes. Timothy was gentle and composed, capable of bringing joy to others and offering valuable advice to clients. Many girls who met him viewed him as the ideal man. Sandra felt the same way when they first encountered each other at the nightclub bar where she worked. At that time, Timothy worked at the club as a security guard in the evening and was very respected. Other men were shy around him, while women often approached him. He was cheerful and engaging and shared fascinating stories from his life. These tales suggested he had a diverse background, including experiences in the film and modeling industry, which piqued Sandra's interest. He claimed he was once supposed to be a stunt double for Vin Diesel, but circumstances led him to pursue a different path. Timothy had a talent for captivating his audience with his stories, which they listened to with interest and belief. Among these narratives was the intriguing claim that he had worked as Tom Cruise's bodyguard for a time. While the truth of this story remains uncertain, many people were eager to believe it. Sandra was much like Timothy in many ways. She was attractive, athletic, confident, and charismatic, which naturally drew people to her. Therefore, it's not surprising that Timothy felt a connection when he first met her. He approached Sandra at the Pinellas Park Club in November 2001, impressed by her looks. Initially, they chatted as friends, enjoying each other's company, and Timothy clearly noticed her above all others. As time passed, their friendship evolved into a romantic relationship, and they began dating. Their romance developed quickly over about 4 months. During this time, Timothy proudly boasted to his friends that he was dating a woman who loved intimacy and adventure, describing their relationship as very passionate. However, their idyllic situation didn't last. They began to experience disagreements and arguments, which Timothy attributed to a particular incident after one wild night at a nightclub. During a party, they were caught in a private moment by a police patrol while in Timothy's Mercedes. Timothy thought Sandra was upset about being seen without clothes, which made her angry. He found humor in the situation, but this only deepened the conflict between them. Although many viewed the incident as a simple misunderstanding, Sandra took it very seriously and was frustrated with Timothy. The disagreements led to a major argument that night. Despite feeling unhappy, they returned to Timothy's house with 2 other girls, and the party continued. At some point, likely due to alcohol and the carefree atmosphere, the girls' behavior annoyed Sandra. Feeling jealous, she asked them to leave. This marked the beginning of issues in her relationship with Timothy. By the end of the night, she decided she needed space to think, which possibly led to a breakup. A couple of days later, Timothy boasted that Sandra couldn't live without him. That's why they had the rough intimacy she initiated. He repeatedly shared stories about how much Sandra enjoyed being treated roughly during intimate moments. He believed that a little pain was acceptable in their relationship and considered it normal. However, not everyone thought their experiences were consensual. Sandra, who had visible bruises after the meeting, shared a different story with her family. She revealed that her boyfriend had set up the meeting and that she only now realized he had lured her into his apartment. Once they arrived, Timothy had already started drinking and became quite drunk. His true nature soon emerged. He became aggressive and started arguing with her. During this confrontation, he hit Sandra, leaving bruises under her eyes. It is clear that no woman should endure such treatment, especially one aspiring to a career in modeling and film, where mutual consent and respect are essential. While her family supported her, Timothy's friends and acquaintances sided with him. Sandra described the horrifying attack by her abusive boyfriend. His violence escalated beyond just hitting her. He tied her to the bed, abused her, and threatened to kill both her and her daughter. In this chaotic and terrifying situation, she felt completely lost. It took the Supreme Court a week to process and understand what she had endured. After much hesitation, she made the decision to report Timothy to the police. For Timothy, this arrest was entirely unexpected. During the arrest, he repeatedly asked what was happening, trying to comprehend the situation. At the police station, he explained his side of the story. He claimed there had been no argument with his girlfriend, they were just throwing a pillow. When he threw the pillow back, he said he swung too hard and accidentally knocked out Sandra's contact lenses, causing her to fall and hit her head. He refuted all allegations of threats or abuse. Sandra took the physical assault she reported very seriously. She provided a detailed account of the incident, and there was no indication of any playful behavior. Everything she described felt very grave and alarming. According to her, after the conflict began, Timothy shoved her onto the bed, sat on top of her, and pressed her head between his legs. He was stronger than she was and used ropes to tie her to the bed. When she screamed and resisted, he hit her several times, leaving bruises under her eyes. She was unable to resist and could not defend herself. Timothy had complete control over the situation. After the assault, he began to threaten her with violence, including the murder of her daughter, which deeply traumatized her. He likely feared being reported to the authorities, and rightfully so. Sandra accused Timothy of both assault and abuse, but unfortunately, it was too late for her to pursue justice. After a week of gathering the strength to approach the police, all physical evidence, such as DNA and bruises, had vanished. Despite this delay, the authorities were determined to respond. They decided to charge Timothy with assault, which could result in a maximum sentence of 10 years in prison. This possibility terrified him, leading him to confide in family and friends about his fears. He declared that he would end his life if he were detained. According to the police, it was during this time of desperation that Timothy devised a deceptive plan, hoping others would believe his troubles would simply vanish. Timothy was released on bail while awaiting trial for assault. Friends joked about his character, predicting that he would try to sleep with as many attractive women as possible before facing the consequences. However, by the fall of 2002, things took an unexpected turn. During this time, Timothy met a young girl named Ashley Laney, who had just graduated from high school. At 19, she fit Timothy's preferred type. She was not overly bold or flashy. He saw her as a quiet, somewhat shy person when they roller skated together. They discovered they shared similar musical tastes. Ashley worked with a friend at an ice cream shop right across from the gym where Timothy was a trainer. He soon realized that the girl he had casually encountered at the skate park was working just a short distance from him. Timothy later admitted that he visited Ashley's shop on purpose because he found her charming, attractive, and lively. However, the odd thing was that Ashley differed significantly from Timothy's usual preferences. Most of the girls he was used to were dancers or barmaids from the clubs where he worked part-time as security, or gym-goers who were bold and self-assured. Ashley was a bright girl with ambitions, studying hard and planning to attend college. However, her family life was far from perfect. She was shocked to discover that her father had spent most of his life in prison for various crimes, only to be briefly released before returning to jail for new offenses. Ashley lived with her mother, who struggled with alcoholism and often lashed out physically when under the influence. Additionally, her mother frequently brought home unsavory partners, which deeply affected her. Her friends believed these traumatic experiences contributed to her feelings of insecurity and vulnerability. Despite her challenges, Ashley longed to find a good partner. She was flattered by the attention of an older man named Timothy and quickly became close to him after he expressed interest. Within a month, they were living together. During this time, Ashley continued to work, selling ice cream alongside her best friend, Charlie Williams. Charlie soon noticed negative changes in Ashley's behavior and suspected that Timothy was having a harmful influence on her fragile state of mind. Ashley became increasingly withdrawn, avoiding those around her. It seemed as though a manipulator had taken control of her life. Despite this, Ashley felt content in her relationship and had no intention of changing it. In fact, she started to distance herself from her close friends and took a new job. Only 2 of her old friends remained in contact with her. One of them joined Timothy at the gym, and eventually, they decided to start their own personal training business for athletes. In public, Timothy acted like a man deeply in love with Ashley, constantly expressing his genuine feelings and serious intentions. However, Ashley's friend Charlie suspected that this was all a facade. She heard rumors about Timothy being unfaithful and noted that he did not make much of an effort to hide his flirtations. This led to persistent gossip about his involvement with various women at the bar. Charlie tried several times to discuss her concerns with Ashley, believing that the situation was unhealthy. Under the influence of a manipulator, Ashley could be putting herself in danger. Ashley ignored any evidence against her boyfriend, Timothy, and fully trusted him. Charlie thought Ashley was simply in love. Unfortunately, Charlie's attempts to help her were unsuccessful, and they began to drift apart, just as Ashley's relationships with others in her social circle did. By the spring of 2003, almost everyone had distanced themselves, leaving only Timothy. He told Ashley that he was facing a serious prison sentence. At the same time, he convinced Ashley that his ex-girlfriend, Sandra, was lying when she said she couldn't live without him. This manipulation gave him considerable power over Ashley. After that moment, Timothy decided to turn Ashley against Sandra. It wasn't difficult for him to do, especially given Ashley's sincere feelings and her reliance on him for support. The breakup with Timothy meant that Ashley would have to return to the trailer park to live with her mother, a prospect she dreaded more than anything. She wanted to avoid going back to the terrible past she had fought so hard to escape. In return, Timothy not only asked her to be his girlfriend but also offered her a business opportunity in which she would be an equal partner. This made Ashley financially and emotionally dependent on him. The manipulation didn't stop there. About a week before the trial for the attack, Timothy and Ashley got married. He later admitted to his friends that it was his idea. They held their wedding ceremony at the gym where they worked, with no witnesses or wedding rings, just a marriage certificate. Although it lacked romance, things worsened when they couldn't go on their honeymoon due to the circumstances. Then, just a day after their wedding on July 5, 2003, Sandra was attacked and killed while she was parking her car in the garage. She was attacked 8 times at close range, and forensic experts discovered numerous shell casings in the garage. When investigating Sandra's death, the police quickly realized that Timothy was her only potential enemy with a motive. He was not only accused of assault but also became the main suspect in her murder. The detectives faced one major challenge. Timothy had easily provided an alibi for the time of the attack. He claimed to have been at home eating pizza, an account confirmed by his friend and the delivery courier who personally handed the pizza to him. When investigators arrived at his home, they decided to speak with his new wife, Ashley, who was visibly nervous and appeared scared. She was under a lot of stress, so much so that she almost vomited twice during their conversation. Unfortunately, they didn't gather any significant information during this first meeting. However, afterwards, the police suspected that Ashley might be involved in the crime, and her anxious behavior led them to think she felt guilty. What's suspicious is that just a month before the murder, Ashley's car caught fire. She reported it as theft, but investigators suspected arson. This raised red flags, prompting them to investigate Ashley's background and activities. They discovered that she had purchased several paid computer programs for surveillance, one of which she used to monitor Sandra in real time, making her a suspect. The authorities also interviewed Ashley's mother's new boyfriend, David Abernathy. They found out that he owned several weapons. While a weapon he had previously owned was missing, he had lent another weapon to Ashley shortly before the attack. Furthermore, he still had ammunition for this weapon, which ballistics tests showed matched the shell casings found in Sandra's garage. More evidence supporting the suspicions continued to emerge. Ashley's mobile phone signal was detected near Sandra's house shortly before and after the murder, suggesting that she was present at the scene of the crime. With this evidence, the police arrested Ashley for first-degree murder. She maintained her innocence, claiming she didn't know Sandra, and requested a lawyer. Initially, she appeared confident and did not break under interrogation. However, after 3 weeks in jail, she confessed to attacking Sandra. Ashley revealed that her actions were driven by fear that her husband Timothy would be imprisoned. However, the investigation uncovered that the attack was not impulsive. It was the result of a detailed and planned murder scheme, which included multiple attempts. Before asking David for a weapon, Ashley had taken a small weapon from her mother's trailer. This weapon was simple enough for her to use with little experience, and she practiced handling it. She also experimented with different masks and techniques to conceal her identity. Ashley went to Meshkova dressed for the occasion and painted her face as part of her plan. A month before the murder, Ashley visited the Pinellas Park bar where Sandra worked. That day, she spent hours in her car watching Sandra's vehicle. When Sandra finally left the bar and got into her car, Ashley attacked her. The sound of the gun startled Sandra, leaving her confused and unaware of what had just occurred. She simply got into her car and drove off. If she had realized she was close to death, things might have turned out very differently. In a common mistake made by inexperienced killers, Ashley accidentally shot her own car's mirror because she misaligned her aim. After that, she set her car on fire outside the city and reported it stolen to the police. She then gave some wallpaper to her mother. Following the wedding festivities, a new stage of her conspiracy began. The day after her wedding, Ashley returned to the parking lot of the bar where Sandra worked. This time, armed with a weapon, she fell asleep and missed the moment Sandra got into her car. However, she noticed Sandra's black BMW leaving the lot and, determined not to fail again, followed Sandra's home. There, she attacked Sandra just as she parked in Sandra's garage and was still seated in her car. Timothy was suspected of being involved in a conspiracy, but he claimed to be completely shocked by the events. He insisted that he was unaware of any plan to attack Sandra. However, the detectives believed it resembled a contract killing, suggesting that Ashley had been manipulated into committing the crime rather than motivated by money. Timothy had a strong motive for the murder, which raised further questions. Interestingly, Florida law prevents one spouse from being compelled to testify against the other, providing a significant advantage for Timothy. Yet, this also heightened the detective's suspicion of his potential involvement in planning Sandra's murder. On the night of the murder, Ashley and Timothy made 22 phone calls to each other, leading investigators to suspect they were coordinating a violent plan. The murder weapon was never found, and most of the evidence was circumstantial, necessitating more information for a successful prosecution. As detectives dug deeper into Timothy's background, they discovered that his claims of a successful career were false. In reality, he had no modeling contracts and was a convicted felon with a criminal record that included theft and violent offenses against the wives of one of the undercover agents they employed. Controversy surrounded Sandra's murder, along with the rumors about it. Timothy hinted at key details multiple times and even threatened that if the client reported to the police, there would be serious repercussions. He was arrested and charged with first-degree murder, but he maintained his innocence. In February 2006, just before Timothy's trial began, the prosecutor took advantage of Ashley's vulnerability. They offered her a plea deal to testify against her husband, which would ensure she avoided the death penalty and possibly received a lighter sentence of around 25 years in prison. She accepted the deal, which became a crucial part of the prosecution's case against him. During the trial, the prosecution portrayed Timothy as a manipulative individual who coerced a young and vulnerable Ashley into committing a crime. She detailed the extent of Timothy's control over her life, explaining that she couldn't leave their home without his permission and had no freedom to make friends without his consent. Over time, his possessiveness escalated into emotional and physical abuse. He would hit her, regularly threaten to kick her out of the house, and on several occasions, he caused injuries that made her lose consciousness. Despite this, she feared losing him and didn't want to return to her mother's home, where she felt conditions were even worse. At one point, Ashley realized that the only way to keep Timothy was to eliminate Sandra. This idea didn't come out of nowhere. Her husband had mentioned it after she expressed her desire to get rid of Sandra. He even created a plan for the murder that involved disguises and a weapon. After a failed first attempt, he became furious and threatened Ashley, saying that if she didn't get rid of Sandra, the source of his frustration, he would send her back to her mother in the trailer park. Ashley felt she had no choice. Ashley arrived at Sandra's house at 11:22 p.m. She jumped out of the car and rushed to the garage. Inside, she smashed the car window with a weapon. When Sandra saw her, Sandra began screaming. Without any hesitation, she attacked Sandra multiple times. After confirming that Sandra was dead, she called her husband, Timothy, to inform him that everything was taken care of. He instructed her to dispose of the evidence and to contact him again afterward. Ashley complied. During the trial, she claimed that her motive for the murder was love and the fear of losing Timothy. Timothy maintained his innocence and portrayed Ashley as a manipulative person. He claimed that the idea to kill Sandra was Ashley's and that he had tried to dissuade her from going through with it. However, no one believed him since Sandra's murder clearly benefited him. He wanted to eliminate a witness to his prior attack so that no one could expose him. Timothy attempted to challenge the evidence against him, claiming he was completely opposed to any harm Ashley wanted to inflict but had agreed to help gather evidence against Sandra. He intended to use that evidence to coerce Sandra into not testifying, hoping that this would allow him to remain free. He explained that the phone calls made before and after the massacre were part of the romantic phase of their relationship, during which they communicated frequently when they were not together. However, this claim was contradicted by evidence showing that on other days, their phone activity was minimal, despite his supposed deep feelings. Furthermore, he continued to express his feelings for other women. He formed relationships with different girls both before and after his marriage. The jury deliberated for 4 hours before reaching a verdict, in which they found Timothy Alvin Tracy Humphrey guilty of first-degree murder. 2 days after the sentencing, he returned to the courtroom to hear the decision. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Sandra's mother expressed satisfaction with the verdict, believing that it served justice and was a harsher punishment than that of the death penalty. Later, Timothy attempted to appeal the verdict but was unsuccessful. He is still incarcerated, and his wife, Ashley Laney, is also serving a sentence. On March 10, 2006, Ashley was sentenced to 25 years in prison as part of a plea deal with the prosecution. She will be 46 years old when she is eligible for release in 2028. Hello everyone, today we will learn about another case. The case of Gemma Mitchell. In June 2021, a devout Christian, Mi Kun Chong, also known as Deborah, disappeared without a trace. Her friends had no idea what to do in this situation, as it was extremely out of character for her, especially since Deborah was vulnerable, a weak woman who could not stand up for herself. Just when the investigation began to gain momentum, a heartbreaking discovery was made. A long series of CCTV footage led the authorities to a cold-blooded killer. This crime story happened quite recently in the UK and tells the story of one of the first women whose sentencing was broadcast live on television. All happened in northwest London, where 67-year-old Deborah lived in her home. She was born and raised in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, but later moved to the Wembley area of the UK in 2004. She lived alone and shared her two-story house with a tenant. Deborah was a parishioner of the Emmanuel Church Center, located about 6 miles from her home. Being a pious woman, she regularly attended church services. Neighbors described Deborah as a cheerful, active, but slightly eccentric older woman who regularly visited her neighbors' houses for tea and company. As Deborah was a believer and a frequent churchgoer, she met many people over the years, which helped her fit in and become part of her local Wembley community. However, not all was well in her life. Unfortunately, Deborah suffered from several mental health issues, was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and acute stress. Fortunately, Deborah had a few people she could rely on, and one of the women she became close to was a 38-year-old named Gemma Mitchell. Gemma previously lived in Australia for 7 years. She was an osteopath who decided to return to the UK in 2015. Her mother and sister lived in Brent, North Wembley, and Gemma stayed with them. Her family was relatively well off. She received a good education and then went to King's College London, where she earned a degree in humanities that included a course in experimental anatomy. During her studies, Gemma proved to be an outstanding medical student and received awards for her knowledge of the human body. Her mother worked for the British Foreign Office, and the family's property in London was valued at approximately $5 million. Unfortunately, the family had recently fallen on hard times. The house was abandoned and in urgent need of repair. Gemma presented herself as a pious person, which was similar to Deborah. They met at the church in August 2020. Unfortunately, Gemma was unable to work as an osteopath in the UK due to the discrepancy between Australian and British practices and found herself essentially without a job. However, to bring Deborah closer, Gemma offered her services as a spiritual healer to help Deborah cope with her mental disorders. It is clear that this could not in any way address Deborah's current problems, as her schizophrenia persisted. By the spring of 2021, she was prescribed stronger medications. The people around her began to notice that Deborah had become more vulnerable and prone to strange behavior. In recent months, she had developed an obsession with Prince Charles and Boris Johnson. It's quite a sad story. Deborah believed that she had a parasocial relationship with Prince Charles and she could talk to him through a video on YouTube. She often set the table for the Prince and Boris Johnson as if they were going to show up at her house at any moment. After sending them several strange letters, she received a referral for psychiatric treatment. After Deborah was admitted to a medical facility for 2 weeks, she was prescribed a new course of medications. Although she did not want to take them, her friends persuaded her to go back. After that, for the most part, Deborah's life returned to normal. Her friends rejoiced with her and looked forward to the summer. However, on June 11, 2021, she suddenly disappeared. On that day, Deborah's lodger began to worry when he could not find her or contact her. Given the current state of her mental health, he knew it would be wise to immediately report this to the authorities. The tenant had seen Deborah the day before, so she could not have been gone for very long. CCTV footage recently confirmed this. The footage showed Deborah walking along Chaplin Road accompanied by her lodger. It is worth noting that Deborah did not walk very well, so if she was on the run, it would have been difficult for her to manage without transportation. As the days passed, it became increasingly obvious that something unusual had happened to Deborah. She had never disappeared like that before. Given her mental health and physical problems, this painted a worrying picture for the authorities. But despite Deborah's silence, some news about her emerged. Gemma informed Deborah's tenant that Deborah had decided to return home to Malaysia to spend time with her family. According to Gemma, Deborah had decided to return home for a year to clear her head. This raised doubts among police officers. To fly to Malaysia, Deborah would have had to present her passport at customs, but there were no stamps recorded on it. No one had seen her leave the house, no local taxi companies had given her a lift, and there was no banking activity indicating that she had used any public transport. Days turned, and there were still no confirmed sightings of Deborah. However, 16 days after she went missing, a discovery was made 200 miles from Wembley. There was a small coastal town called Salcombe. It has beautiful beaches and lovely nature. Many people visit this area as tourists. One woman who came to discover the beauty of new places found much more than she expected. On June 27, 2021, the woman was walking with her family along Bennett Road in Salcombe when she saw a nightmarish scene as she descended the old steps. Nearby lay a decomposing body, and the head was missing. The authorities were immediately called, and upon their arrival, forensic experts found that the body had been dumped along with a church business card and excerpts from the Bible. They soon became known that the body belonged to Mi Kun Chom. Due to the state of decomposition, an autopsy was unable to determine her exact cause of death. However, it could be said with certainty that she was missing her head. Injuries consistent with an assault were found on her body. Pathologists also believed that Deborah had been dead for about 2 weeks, which was consistent with the time of her disappearance. With the case now classified as a murder, investigators stepped up their efforts to find Deborah's killer, and surprisingly, it didn't take them long to find a potential suspect. CCTV footage from around Deborah's home revealed some very disturbing movements. As officers checked all the friends who knew Deborah, they began to focus on her life. Deborah would periodically hold seances in her garden, and Gemma was often with her. Friends reported that Deborah repeatedly mentioned that Gemma and Jesus healed her. These two women had previously been friends, but at least a week before Deborah disappeared, they may have quarreled over money. This theory was taken into consideration by the officers. Working in the field of osteopathy in Australia, Gemma stated on her professional website that she focused on the genetics of anatomy and the dissection of human cadavers. However, after she returned to England in 2015, She was no longer able to continue her professional life as a result of her circumstances. Gemma worked nowhere else, although she lived with her mother in their old family home in Brent. According to eyewitnesses, the rooms were filled with broken furniture and rubbish. Some rooms were impossible to enter. There were boxes and suitcases, freezers full of food, old mattresses, and building materials everywhere. The kitchen was described as very dirty, with various remains of rotting food on the stove and torn food packaging. The second floor of the house was under renovation. The walls and ceilings were unfinished. There was no roof. The bathroom was stained and in very poor condition. Overall, the whole house looked terrible. Maybe this house was the cause of the conflict between Deborah and Gemma. According to the collected messages, to renovate Gemma's family home, Deborah was asked to give her 200,000 British pound, and Deborah promised her this. However, after a while, Deborah advised Gemma to sell the house and enjoy the money because life is too short. In a subsequent message, Deborah told Gemma that further repairs and construction would cost a lot of money, which Deborah had nothing for. And from that moment on, the relationship between them deteriorated. Over the next few days, Gemma became more and more persistent and aggressive towards Deborah. On June 8, 2021, Deborah finally got tired of listening to Gemma's complaints and sent her an SMS in which she wrote, "Until you resolve the issue with the house, I do not want you to come to me. I am experiencing stress from your presence." Just 3 days after this, Deborah disappeared. Fortunately, many surveillance cameras filled in all the gaps and allowed law enforcement to create a clear picture of what happened. At 6:15 a.m. on June 11th, Gemma was seen leaving her abandoned house with a large travel suitcase and a backpack on her shoulders. At that time, she was wearing a hat. By 6:40 a.m., Gemma had already changed her clothes, covered her face with a mask, and put her backpack inside the suitcase. In this CCTV footage, Gemma can be seen moving towards Deborah's house. At 7:56 a.m., she took off her hat. However, she could still be seen with the suitcase and mask on her face. Presumably, Deborah was tragically killed in the next 4 hours, because at 12:05 p.m., Gemma was again caught on CCTV, this time carrying 2 suitcases. They both seemed quite heavy as she struggled to carry them. The smaller suitcase most likely contained personal belongings and Deborah's financial documents, which Gemma needed for her further actions, as she intended to use them to create a will. Then, she called a taxi to take her with the 2 suitcases to the right address, but Gemma had to wait for the car for 40 minutes. It was only at 4:15 p.m. that she returned home with a large blue suitcase. Later that evening, Gemma went to a hospital located in the center of town for treatment of a broken finger. She told the doctors that she accidentally pinched her finger in a door. In the following days, in an attempt to cover up the crime, Gemma sent several fraudulent emails to a missing persons charity, and she sent a message to Deborah's tenant to say that the lady of the house had gone to Malaysia to visit relatives. Now, let's fast forward a few days and see that Gemma is on the move again. On June 26 at 8:05 a.m., a CCTV camera across the road from her house recorded Gemma booting up as she had rented a car from a car rental company the night before. On the way to Salcombe, she stopped at a gas station, where a surveillance camera captured her entering the store. After this, Gemma drove another 200 miles southwest to a coastal town. She parked her car near Bennett Road at about 9:12 p.m., where she found a secluded spot to dump the body. She was seen leaving the area 41 minutes later by the same camera. Now, despite being caught on several surveillance cameras, Gemma thought her plan had worked out well. However, there was one part of her carefully thought out scheme that even she couldn't predict. On the way back to London, her rental car had a ruptured inner tube, so Gemma had to stop at a service station and call a repairman to change the tire. This man still remembers his strange encounter with her. She seemed confused and bewildered, insisted that he not climb into the trunk of her car, not to mention putting a tire in there. Additionally, she wanted to keep the old flat tire. The repairman also noted that the car had a strange, heavy, and musty smell, as if someone had been sleeping in it without any ventilation. Unfortunately, he didn't know this at the time, but the car smelled of death when he had her tire fixed. Gemma returned home, where she returned the Volvo and threw the blue suitcase on the roof of a barn belonging to one of the neighbors. The very next day, Deborah's decapitated body was found. The authorities would need another 5 days to find her head. All these clues naturally pointed to Gemma, and the authorities decided to pay a small visit to her 15 minutes before midnight, taking her into custody. Gemma was immediately handcuffed, and the police began to search the house, looking for evidence that could link Gemma to Deborah's murder. As a result, Deborah's personal belongings and financial documents were found, as well as a fake will from Deborah that had been created on a computer. In this will, Gemma named herself and her mother as the beneficiaries of Deborah's entire estate, which was valued at the time at approximately £700,000. Gemma's first official interrogation was held 2 days later and was filled with a whole host of evidence, questions that Gemma did not answer. There are a great many surveillance cameras in modern London, and the fact that Gemma thought her journey with a heavy suitcase containing Deborah's body would go unnoticed did not work. Apparently, Gemma became more open during the interrogation and realized that she had no hope of justifying herself. Thus, during the first and subsequent interrogations, she remained silent, refusing to provide her version of events. Despite her refusal to cooperate with the investigation, the trial of Gemma Mitchell began a year later. On October 11, 2022, Gemma Mitchell not only denied killing Deborah but also refused to testify in her own defense. Her defense team claimed that there was no evidence to support the assertion that Deborah's body had been kept in the suitcase and that no evidence of a struggle was found in Deborah's house. Additionally, no weapon was discovered that could have separated the head from the body. But still, the motive for this crime was alleged to be money. The prosecution claimed that Gemma killed Deborah in order to forge a will and obtain money for home repairs. A notable level of heartlessness was revealed when it was noted that in the period between the murder and her trip with Deborah's body in the suitcase to Salcombe, Gemma went on a date with someone she had met on the internet at the London Zoo. It is worth noting once again that Gemma graduated with a first-class honors degree in the humanities, including a course in experimental anatomy, meaning she had the skills to remove a head from a body, although it is unclear why she did this. The deliberation, the jury delivered their verdict on October 27, 2022. Gemma Mitchell was formally found guilty of the murder of 67-year-old Mi Kun Chom. Gemma's conviction made national headlines. During the sentencing phase of the trial, which was broadcast live on television, Gemma became the first convicted murderer in England and Wales to be sentenced live, as well as being the first woman in the UK to have her sentence filmed. The judge's words to Gemma were quoted as follows. He stated that she had left her residence early in the morning with a large suitcase that, as shown on surveillance camera, was either empty or contained very little. He mentioned that she took public transport to Deborah's residence and stayed there for more than 4 hours. The judge noted that the suitcase she brought home was now clearly full and heavy. He expressed no doubt that she had killed Deborah in her home and concluded that, considering she had not provided any explanation during her interrogations, she had gone to Mi Kun Chom's house that morning with the intent to kill. He remarked that she showed absolutely no remorse and seemed to completely deny what she had done. With the irrefutable evidence against her, the judge announced that Gemma Mitchell was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 34 years, which meant that Gemma would not be eligible for parole until July 10, 2055. During Gemma's trial, a statement from Deborah's sister, who lived in Malaysia, was read to the court. In this statement, the sister wrote, "They still don't understand how she died. This secret will haunt she forever." Gemma never accepted responsibility for Deborah's murder, leaving many questions unanswered. However, for many, the motive appears clear and simple. Deborah was a vulnerable woman seeking help for her mental health problems. She confided in her friend Gemma, even offering her a significant amount of her savings to help with the house. But Gemma's actions constituted a vile and disgusting crime. Since Gemma's conviction, several of her former friends have come forward to share their own experiences with her, revealing that she had always tried to steal money, lured partners, and was a real snake. In the end, the case of Gemma Mitchell stands as a chilling reminder of how trust can be exploited in the most sinister ways. What began as a friendship rooted in shared faith and mutual support spiraled into a calculated act of betrayal, driven by greed and desperation. Deborah's tragic fate not only shattered the lives of those who knew her but also left an indelible mark on the UK's legal history, with Gemma's sentencing etched into public memory through its unprecedented live broadcast. As Gemma serves her life sentence, the unanswered questions surrounding Deborah's final moments linger, a haunting echo of a crime that stripped away a vulnerable woman's life and exposed the dark depths of human nature. Hello everyone, today we will learn about another case. The case of Janet Loretta Tillman. Even the most pious image can conceal a dangerous person. Clever manipulators can deceive entire communities, gather loyal followers, and carry out sinister deeds behind their backs. The population of Vincent, Alabama, USA, is about 2,000 people, and here you can still encounter neighbors who are not afraid to leave their doors open or their keys in their cars. Timothy Dane Tillman worked at the local Renaissance Center and was considered the best preacher in town. Many looked up to him as a mentor and source of support. Nevertheless, the man's story turned out to be full of mysteries. Until 2000, Timothy traveled across the states, preaching the gospel. He managed to embark on an extensive pilgrimage from Florida to Minnesota. People responded positively to his words and felt supported by him. The pastor's wife, Janet Tillman, was a very modest woman and a caring mother who embodied the image of a priest's wife. She was always there, trying to support her husband throughout their marriage, during which they welcomed two daughters, the eldest, Jessica, and the youngest, Fanny, who seemed to withstand any obstacles and problems. The pastor never forgot that the foundation of his work was charitable activity, demonstrating this through actions rather than words. For example, when Hurricane Katrina hit Louisiana, he saw an opportunity to support the community that was struggling to recover from the disaster. In September 2005, he proposed a fundraising event called the Hunt for Turkey, which was essentially an outdoor shooting range. The proceeds were meant to help those in need. Everything was organized as best as possible, but on October 22, 2005, after the third shot, one of the rifles jammed. The pastor, along with his wife, was concerned because the situation seemed quite dangerous. One of the church members offered to fix the gun, but Timothy declined, worried about the safety of the many children and strangers present in the church. He decided to put the gun in the trunk of his car, where it remained for 4 days. On October 26, Janet took the faulty weapon, while her husband took 2 other rifles, intending to store them under their bed. Janet went first, with Timothy following her. Suddenly, a shot rang out from the pastor's house. According to Timothy's confession, when he entered the room, the rifle hit the door frame and accidentally discharged. A bullet struck Janet, who was a couple of meters away from him. She was seriously injured and began to bleed in her husband's arms. As help arrived, she repeatedly told him that she loved him and their daughters. When the police and ambulance finally arrived, it was already too late to save Janet. The pastor was overwhelmed with grief, crying almost constantly and covering his face with his hands. The most devastating news for him was that his wife did not survive. At that point, few understood what had happened, and the police were preparing to take Timothy to the station for questioning and to record an official statement. He wandered around the church courtyard, blaming himself for inadvertently killing his beloved wife. Everyone knew him as a good person, incapable of any cruelty, and they wanted to support him, convinced that it had been an accident. When Timothy was at the station, he was able to give a full account of the incident to the police. He described what had happened in detail, explaining about the jammed rifle and that Janet had wanted to protect those present by putting it under their bed. He also mentioned that she had taken the 2 remaining weapons to the room, where one of the rifles accidentally discharged upon hitting the door frame. The police found him to be credible. He seemed like a decent person, a worthy member of society, and a pastor. It was hard to believe he had any malicious intent. Consequently, there was no reason to detain him, and Timothy was allowed to return home to his children. When Janet's sister learned this tragic news, she was shocked and decided to call her brother to share her feelings. The first assumption he voiced was that this was not an accident. They discussed everything and approached the police with their suspicions. After collecting all necessary data, the investigators decided to look into Timothy. To their surprise, it turned out that the church minister held 2 driver's licenses. One was issued in his name, and the other was in the name of Timothy Patrick McNally. Interestingly, the second license was issued just 4 months before the tragedy, raising suspicions and indicating that the pastor had something to hide. He reverted to his official name just a few days prior to the incident. During this time, the victim's family had been discussing secrets that had troubled her in the past, which now began to be confirmed in unexpected ways. From the very beginning, Janet's relatives were convinced that her death was not an accident, and they had good reasons for their suspicions. In fact, Timothy's relationship with Janet's family had always been strained. They considered him a liar and a manipulator, believing that he had deliberately turned Janet against them to the point where their connection was nearly severed. Despite these difficult relations, they felt obliged to say a proper goodbye to Janet and sought justice. Tension arose the moment the relatives of the deceased appeared on the threshold of the house where Janet had died. They didn't even shake hands with Timothy, as everyone thought he was the culprit. Janet noticed that the pastor was avoiding eye contact, and Timothy did not offer any words of greeting or apology but immediately began to express how much he loved Janet, insisted that he would never harm her, as if he were justifying himself. After several days of intermittent communication and observing all the oddities, Janet's relatives were convinced that she was a victim of deliberate murder. They even sent an email to the district attorney asking them to investigate, insisting that this crime was not an accident and believing that Timothy Tillman was the killer. After not receiving the expected response, Janet's sister, Joan, contacted the Alabama Bureau of Investigation. Subsequently, an FBI agent was sent to meet with the sheriff from the city police department. He was shown a recording of the police talking to Timothy. In this video, the agent did not notice anything suspicious. According to him, Timothy was acting scared and very confused, but this fear could have been caused by the death of his wife. Suspicions began to strengthen when the FBI agent learned about 2 driver's licenses belonging to Timothy from before the accident. From that moment, the agent decided to investigate the pastor's past in the hope of confirming or refuting the fears surrounding him. Curiously, the minister of the church had a far from holy past. From the outset, it became evident that he had a weakness for women, resulting in periodic infidelities. He liked to visit strip clubs, which was known to his wife, who initially felt outraged but eventually resigned herself to his behavior, choosing not to divorce for the sake of their children. Timothy married Janet in December 1983, their first daughter was born in 1986, and their second in 1991. The Tillman family lived in Jacksonville, Florida, where Timothy worked as a pastor. It was discovered that in 1986, Timothy was seen leaving a strip club, behavior that parishioners deemed unworthy for a preacher. Following their complaint, he was fired from the church. His sinful lifestyle could not be atoned for by the eloquence he possessed, forcing him to seek new employment. However, he became a pastor again, though not for long, as he was soon caught in an inappropriate relationship with one of the parishioners and was fired again. To avoid traveling around the country in search of a new position, he took a job in a prison. During this period, Timothy liked to call himself a policeman. In reality, he worked as a civilian, sitting at the entrance, registering those coming and going. One day, he encountered a call girl. Later, she claimed that he had abused her near her home. This incident was investigated, and the former pastor was subsequently charged and sentenced to 10 months in prison in Minnesota. The abuse accusation seemed too much even for the all-forgiving Janet. During this time, Janet decided she had had enough. Exhausted by his regular betrayals, she and her children chose to start anew. She contacted her relatives, who helped her relocate to Alabama, where she found a job in the same office as her sister. This reunion allowed her to learn just how sinful Timothy truly was, which ultimately ruined their relationship. Janet began working in the office and contemplated a career, finding it much better than continuing a relationship with a husband unable to control his animalistic urges. For several months, the sisters lived together. Janet even started to recover and forget about her problematic husband. Then, unexpectedly, Timothy called. He stated that he was being released from prison early for good behavior and wanted to surprise his family. He asked for forgiveness and swore he had reformed, constantly insisting that he loved his children and that Janet could not deprive their daughters of their father. Despite her deep disappointment and feelings of betrayal, Janet allowed her husband to return to the family. Close friends warned Janet that this was a bad idea, but she did not heed their cautions and began to distance herself from her family once again. The Tillman family reunited, and in 2000, Timothy vowed to leave his past behind. They began to attend the Assembly of God, where he befriended the pastor and gradually began to speak in the church. Over time, this eloquent speaker opened doors to other religious organizations. Thus, Timothy first appeared at a revival event in Vincent, Alabama, where his wife hoped everything would be different, wanting to avoid another move. In January 2003, when they visited the center, there was no pastor present. It seemed like an incredibly fortunate coincidence. Timothy volunteered to conduct the service and performed so well that they decided to hire him without conducting any additional checks or interviews. He was seen as a very talented and eloquent preacher. Gradually, the unholy father managed to become the senior pastor of the church while concealing his legal issues. He behaved with restraint around women and did not visit questionable establishments. Indeed, before hiring someone for such a position, they meticulously checked for any convictions related to abuse, and his previous dismissals from several churches could have posed a significant problem. Nevertheless, Timothy succeeded in hiding these incidents, typically using standard excuses like losing or forgetting his documents. It was astounding, but it seemed to have worked. A skilled manipulator could have talked excessively. In Timothy's biography, there was still nothing to cling to. Concrete evidence was needed to start building a case for premeditated murder. Eventually, the police became interested in the case and actively got involved in the investigation. Timothy was not informed about all this. He continued to lead an ordinary life, believing that he had fooled everyone once again, while the investigation's suspicions grew. Meanwhile, he took advantage of the support of the local community in every possible way. The locals rallied around him and his children. They supported their beloved pastor and even provided him with financial assistance. A few weeks passed. Suddenly, Timothy announced that he needed to leave his daughters with family friends for a while and attend a pastor's conference in Washington state. The event was expected to take a significant amount of time. It seemed strange that a man would decide to undertake such a long trip during this difficult period. The pastor's phone calls needed to be checked. During the trip, one number contacted Timothy more frequently than others. The contact was investigated and turned out to belong to a woman named Molly Bizzari. Considering that the pastor was traveling on a business visit, it seemed odd that he maintained constant communication with a woman, including evening conversations clearly outside of working hours since the death of his wife. It had been several months since he returned from his visit to Washington and attempted to start anew with his children. Unexpectedly, Jessica called her grandmother and reported that she had a fight with her father after discovering suspicious messages on his social media accounts. Judging by these messages, her father seemed to have been involved with Molly during his trip to Washington. The daughter was shocked to learn that he had forgotten her mother so quickly and found a new romantic interest. As a result, rumors began to spread that the pastor had a mistress for a long time, possibly even during his wife's life. In any case, now the pastor could have a motive for committing murder. Perhaps his relationship with this new woman had become serious, and he decided to marry her. Divorce is always long, difficult, and expensive. If he was indeed grieving for his deceased wife, who had died in an accident, he would not have so quickly pursued a new woman. Thus, the first confirmation of suspicions was found. Now it was necessary to determine when his acquaintance with Molly had begun. The police began to examine Timothy's emails and discovered that they had first contacted several years ago. It was an anonymous communication that he could maintain unnoticed. Interestingly, he had been trying to win Molly's favor for a long time. During this period, Janet worked a lot and did not suspect her husband, or perhaps she simply did not want to confront any potential infidelities. Meanwhile, the communication continued, and Timothy became more immersed in their long-distance relationship, clearly wanting to advance it to a new level. Gradually, he learned that Molly's father was a military man. At this point, he decided to create a fake identity and reveal it to his interlocutor. He posed as a naval officer. As it turned out, he even visited a military goods and paraphernalia store where he assembled a Navy lieutenant's uniform to impress his mistress. Now, before the detective stood a man leading a double life, one with a wife he had buried and another with a woman on the side. The investigators were convinced that all of this was more than mere coincidence. The trip to Washington raised many questions. It was apparent that Tim had used a driver's license under a different name, which confused not only his mistress. The preparation seemed too serious. Until now, it was unclear why he would kill his wife if it was possible to simply get a divorce. Soon, the detectives had an answer. Perhaps a divorce could undermine his reputation in his new community, and he feared revealing the darker aspects of his personality. Additionally, it later came to light that he received a payout from Janet's life insurance after her death, which could also have served as an additional motive for murder. The detectives decided to meet and speak with other church employees. In addition, the police informed the public about the man's history of violations, including charges related to abuse. Many were shocked to learn that the pastor was capable of such atrocities and how insidious the liar was. However, there were supporters who viewed the accusations as a conspiracy against the holy man. Damage to the pastor's reputation was done. Detectives sought tension so that the suspect would begin to make rash decisions and mistakes. Many townspeople began to believe that Timothy had deliberately killed Janet. The whole scenario, which was being portrayed as an accident, seemed strange. The decision to take the weapon from the event to his home, specifically to his bedroom, did not seem justified. And now it seemed clear why the armed forces had acted this way. Rumors began to spread. Church members stopped feeling the same reverence after the preacher's speeches as they had before. On the contrary, uncertainty grew, and suspicions about him increased. Timothy stopped being trusted, and some openly expressed dissatisfaction with his behavior. Apparently, the tension led the pastor to turn to the church leadership after some time and express his desire to leave his post for another location. Despite everything, there were supporters within the community who provided him with financial aid and assistance with his move. The pastor claimed that he intended to take his daughters and return to Florida to be closer to his family. For the detectives, this looked like a disaster. The police officers from the armed forces did not yet have the necessary evidence to press charges and arrest the suspect. They were forced to simply watch as Timothy left Alabama. At some point, the detectives began to fear that he would escape justice, but investigators did not abandon the case and continued working to achieve justice for Janet. The situation changed rapidly after Timothy's departure. His sister called the police and reported a curious phone conversation that had taken place just minutes earlier. While she was at work, the phone rang with someone inquiring about Janet, identifying themselves as a representative of a credit institution. They stated that Janet had taken out a large sum of money on January 6, 2006, which was very curious since Janet had already died by that time. It was about $5,000, indicating that Timothy had used his wife's name and reputation to commit financial fraud. There were suspicions he could be involved in more such episodes. However, the most valuable implication was that it provided an opportunity to arrest him for fraud. This, of course, gave detectives a good opportunity to question Timothy about his wife's death. The suspect was not naive, so it was necessary to act carefully. The investigators knew the suspect well. They carefully analyzed his personality and behavioral characteristics. Therefore, they aimed to provoke a loss of self-control, which would allow them to secure a confession at the right moment. Although the chances were slim, this might have been their only chance. The detectives traveled to Florida for what would be one of the most challenging interrogations of their careers. It began as an ordinary conversation, and under pressure from the evidence, Timothy confessed to the fraud. He claimed he had financial difficulties after the death of his wife and the loss of his job, stating that he needed money for his move. Naturally, This was not the only thing the detectives wanted to discuss, so they smoothly changed the topic to the accidental shot that had occurred in his marital bedroom. Unexpectedly, his story began to shift. Initially, Timothy had stated that he accidentally discharged the weapon against the door frame. However, now he claimed that the rifle had slipped from his hands. He then added that he had accidentally tripped over the threshold when entering the room. All these inconsistencies provided the detectives with opportunities to exploit this change in narrative, particularly concerning the switch of the surname from Tillman to McNally shortly before his wife's death. Timothy had an excuse. He claimed that his brother was involved with Janet and that he did not want to be part of the Tillman family. Eventually, he decided it was foolish and changed his surname back. Of course, this strange story was not believed, and the obvious lies only strengthened suspicion against him. However, a confession or some material evidence was necessary. The officers spoke with Molly. She willingly agreed to cooperate with the investigation, stating that the trip to Washington was made for an engagement proposal, supposedly in August 2005, before his wife's death. According to her, Timothy had initially introduced himself as a divorced pastor, and that's how their relationship began. All this time, she believed he was free, but it turned out they were only separated by distance. He had surrounded Molly with lies about his military service, even claiming he was conducting secret missions on behalf of the U.S. government. He then recounted a tragic story about his ex-wife's death, presenting a different version of the accidental shooting. Previously, he had not mentioned anything like that. According to him, Janet had supposedly moved the rifles when the shot accidentally went off. In subsequent letters, Timothy referred to Molly as a kindred spirit and expressed his eagerness for their reunion, stating that she would become a mother figure for his daughters. In support of her words, Molly provided access to the correspondence she had with Timothy. Her entire story was confirmed that the main suspect had become engaged to a woman he had found while his wife was still alive. This only confirmed the suspicions against him. Timothy Tillman was again interrogated and immediately began to lose his composure. He shouted that he had not killed his wife, even though 6 months had passed since her death. But even then, the authorities still did not have enough evidence. The case was just being built, so Timothy was arrested for financial fraud. The man was extradited back to Alabama. Janet's family expected justice, but unexpectedly, Timothy was released from jail. It was too early to panic. This was a deliberate move. Timothy remained under suspicion, and the detectives wanted the killer to believe his story was being accepted. The list of charges against him was limited to forgery of documents, and for the next 5 months, Timothy lived in Florida with his daughters, hoping that all the bad was behind him. Finally, a case against the pastor was built, and they decided to charge him with the murder of Janet. He was arrested without warning. According to detectives, at that moment, his knees almost buckled from surprise. The big problem was the presence of only circumstantial evidence. Therefore, there was a high probability that the criminal would escape punishment altogether. However, the prosecution took this risk and sought a confession, which Timothy refused, opting not to accept a deal with the prosecutor's office. It was also unclear how the shot from the rifle was provoked. The prosecution had only one rule to prove guilt: the constant changes in testimony during interrogations and other lies. On the prosecution's side, there was a witness named Jimmy Abbott, the man who had brought the rifles to the shooting event. He had personally repaired and inspected the weapons before giving them to Timothy, ensuring everything was in good order and unloaded. They had only managed to shoot from one rifle, which jammed. Thus, to conduct an accidental shot with any other weapon, it would have been necessary to deliberately load it. Moreover, the pastor's decision to postpone the event because one gun jammed seemed strange, as it was possible to simply continue shooting with other rifles at the shooting range. Timothy's choice to take the rifles into his bedroom generally baffled everyone. A few days before the tragedy, Timothy wrote a letter to Molly's father, convincing him of his serious intentions. According to Timothy, he would soon solve all his problems, and they would get married. The prosecution believed that under certain circumstances, the defendant would kill again without hesitation. Timothy himself refused to testify in court. Despite using his classic method of presenting himself as a pious man, the jury saw through his lies. For many, his demeanor changed dramatically. The man who had been a spiritual leader for an entire community turned out to be a cold-blooded killer who did not even look at his children as he left the courtroom. Timothy Dane Tillman was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life imprisonment in October 2009. Following this, there were numerous petitions, and even a retrial took place, but his guilt in the murder was once again confirmed. Timothy was also sentenced to 10 years in prison for forgery of documents and fraud. The killer remains behind bars and will probably never be released. Hello everyone, today we will learn about another case. The case of Thad Reynolds. On the morning of Monday, July 5, 2004, when it was still dark at the Frito-Lay distribution center, which was located in one of the suburbs of Georgia, USA, a courier was preparing to load his car with parcels to start his usual work shift. As he approached the offices, he noticed something unusual. An unfamiliar man was quickly moving across the parking lot. The man looked around warily. Typically, employees arrived much later, with only a few workaholics showing up early. Initially, the courier did not think much of it, until he became an unwitting witness to even more suspicious behavior. As soon as this unfamiliar man approached a mini-van parked inconspicuously, he took off his shirt and threw it in the trunk, after which he changed it while looking around. The stranger then got behind the wheel and drove away, oblivious to the courier watching him. Concerned by the man's behavior, the courier approached the spot where the car had been parked and noticed blood on the asphalt. Everything seemed increasingly suspicious. When the witness entered the office to see what was going on inside, he found the general manager of the distribution center, Thad Reynolds, unconscious on the floor in a pool of his own blood. Alarmed, the courier immediately called 911. Within minutes, an ambulance crew arrived at the office, but the community was shaken by this event. In the small suburb where many knew each other, such a tragic death seemed unthinkable. This news especially alarmed the parishioners of the local church, who knew Thad Reynolds well as his wife, Michelle. Thad was not only the general manager of the distribution center, but also a volunteer pastor at the Baptist church. The Reynolds seemed like a beautiful and loving couple who had 4 daughters and a happy, established life together. Thad was a devoted father and a devout Christian who dedicated his life to his family and helping others. Back in the 80s, Michelle and Thad were ordinary high school students who fell in love. Michelle was a cheerleader who became prom queen, and Thad was a popular, handsome football player with great expectations. It seemed like they was made for each other. They were often referred to as Ken and Barbie. Both were very religious, as were their families. They married in a Baptist church in 1987, right after graduation. The newlyweds started their careers, with Thad working and Michelle as an assistant administrator. They dreamed of a beautiful house, a video camera, and going on a cruise. These goals were achieved quite quickly. In 1992, they welcomed a daughter, which brought significant changes to their lives. At that moment, Michelle became a housewife, wanting to be a loving mother and wife. During this period, she delved into everything necessary to cope with the growing needs of the family. It seemed like everything was going well, but in 1993, a year after the birth of their daughter, Michelle admitted that she wanted a divorce. It seemed that she saw some kind of liberation in this. However, Thad viewed the situation as a real tragedy. During this time, he stopped attending church. As a pastor, Thad struggled with what to do in this situation, but he received strong support from his parishioners, who prayed for him. Even so, Thad and Michelle divorced, and Thad was heartbroken. He could not come to terms with the situation and was persistent in wanting to win back his beloved. At first, she did not agree, and he tried to build relationships with other women but could not forget Michelle. Thad did not give up, and finally, 2 years after the divorce, his efforts bore fruit. Thad thanked the parishioners of the church for their prayers that had been answered. Thad and Michelle remarried in 1997, in the same church. They built a new house near Thad's parents' residence, where they had 3 more daughters. Once again, the Reynolds family appeared to be a loving family. The divorce from a few years prior seemed like just a misunderstanding in a distant memory. During this period, Thad received a promotion at work and became a regional manager at the Frito-Lay distribution center. Thad and Michelle became a model for local families with good income, a nice house, and homeschooled children. Thad's faith grew stronger. He sincerely believed that his prayers were heard by God and was very grateful to the local community. They were sociable and formed a wide circle of acquaintances. Thad and Michelle developed particularly warm relationships with Harper, a volunteer church leader and volunteer family pastor at Hollywood Baptist, who also had a wife named Paige and 3 small daughters. All the members of the families got along well. Thad worked mainly remotely, while Michelle and Paige became best friends, accompanying each other everywhere. Their children were also very friendly. However, the idyllic friendship between the families began to change suddenly in 2004 when Paige noticed that her friend was starting to avoid her and making an effort to maintain distance in every possible way. Paige tried to find out what was going on and talked to Thad. He referenced family issues, which allegedly led to a test of Michelle's character. In fact, Michelle wanted Thad to break off her relationship with her husband, who was increasingly immersed in church affairs, distancing himself from her. However, she understood that he would resist this in every way possible. Additionally, a divorce would jeopardize the pastor's career, which he had long sought. An outlet for him was communication with his congregation. They regularly supported him on the internet. In parallel, the men began to work together at the church, which made their meetings more frequent. The last of them occurred on July 4, 2004. The couples met again at the church, and after the service, they went to a local park to spend time together playing volleyball. Paige noticed that Michelle was more flirtatious with her husband that evening than usual. By the end of the joint vacation, the couples gathered their children and went home. She did even ask her husband not to communicate with Michelle. The next morning, on July 5, 2004, Thad got up early, which was normal for him. He arrived at work much earlier than the other employees, after which he would start his shift. After he walked inside, a burgundy minivan stopped in the parking lot near the offices. A man got out and entered the building. A few minutes later, Thad Reynolds was killed. Soon after, the county police received a call from the distribution center. A witness found a body outside of the offices. The deceased was found to have multiple stab wounds all over his body, including several defensive injuries on his hands. He had desperately tried to defend himself but was unable to resist the armed criminal. The witness, a courier, mentioned that he saw the probable attacker but did not get a good look at his face or the license plate number of the car he drove away in because it was very dark. However, he provided some valuable clues. Evidence found at the scene of the bloody massacre confirmed that the suspect and the person seen by the courier were the same. It soon became obvious that the attacker was injured. His blood was found near the doorway at the entrance to the office and near the car. According to investigators, there was nothing unusual about this, as attackers often cut themselves on the blade when using a knife. This provided detectives with several important clues. Firstly, it was clear that the attacker was an inexperienced criminal since a lot of evidence was left at the scene. Aside from the blood, they found a hunting knife, which became the presumed murder weapon, allowing them to track down its place of purchase. Secondly, in the parking lot next to the minivan, they found custom-made glasses, probably dropped by the criminal while he was changing clothes. Apparently, he was trying to escape from the crime scene as quickly as possible and didn't bother to look for them. Naturally, such an accessory could help in identifying the criminal since they had a custom prescription. Thad's family was notified of what had happened, and his wife was envy Thad to identify the deceased. The information spread rapidly throughout the small town. Among the first to learn of the situation was Scott Harper, who immediately got together with his wife and went to support Michelle during this difficult time. Imagine Paige's surprise when she saw that there were no signs of panic or tears of frustration from Michelle, which were typically expected from a grieving widow. Instead, she appeared distant and a bit embarrassed. Thad's loved ones also immediately noticed this strange behavior. Law enforcement officers began working at the crime scene from the first moments. The forensic examination quickly indicated that this attack could not have been random in nature. The only thing that seemed clear was that it had a personal motive. However, the money from the cash register remained untouched. Nothing was taken from Thad, not even his wallet, car keys, or mobile phone, all of which were left in their place. This means the stranger came to the office solely to commit murder. Additionally, the choice of weapon further supported these assumptions, as cruelty and the use of a knife imply close contact. It is likely that the criminal hated his victim and had a personal motive for such a brutal attack. On the evening of the same day, news channels reported that local residents should be aware of a possible threat. The police sought information and attempted to find witnesses who could provide valuable clues. The local community supported several appeals to the police station, but nothing new emerged from the collected evidence. From the outset, detectives paid particular attention to Scott, who was close to the victims like no one else. Yet, none of the community members could believe Scott was capable of such an act, especially given that the relationships between the families seemed very friendly, resembling a model friendship free of hatred or malice. However, the evidence all pointed toward him. He drove a burgundy minivan, which was identical to the killer's vehicle, according to the main witness. Scott was promptly asked to come to the station and provide a statement. The reasons to pay attention to Scott turned out to be more than sufficient. It was revealed that another witness, who worked part-time installing, repairing telephone lines, had accidentally overheard a conversation between Scott and a woman, clearly not his wife, weeks before the crime. In that conversation, Scott even called her by name, Michelle. They flirted so openly that it was reminiscent of young lovers. Furthermore, Scott wore custom-made glasses, as everyone knew he had severe vision problems, making the accessory significant in identifying the criminal. They clearly had a motive to get rid of Thad, who was an obstacle to their happiness. Gradually, Scott Harper's wife began to notice unusual moments in his behavior. When reasonable suspicions arose, she became even more attentive. Firstly, Paige could not find her husband's glasses, which he always wore. Secondly, there were some bruises and scratches under his eyes from the glasses. In addition, there were bandages on his index and middle fingers, which he attributed to an injury received in the gym. The only thing missing was material evidence confirming Scott's involvement. The detectives expect Thad to find bloody clothes belonging to the killer, but it was all in vain. The search of Harper's house yielded no results. On Wednesday, July 7th, Scott was being interrogated at the police station. He attributed his injured hand to an accident at the gym, where he had crushed his fingers. Scott denied having had an affair with Michelle, also stated that he had lost his glasses and could not provide them to the detectives despite all persistent requests. He allegedly did not even have a doctor's prescription for their manufacture. Paige began to grow suspicious of her husband, but he stubbornly remained silent. According to Paige, he had been behaving strangely since Monday morning. Despite a whole list of circumstantial evidence, Scott was released from the police station. Naturally, this did not mean that the investigators took him at his word. It just took time to obtain warrants and gather more incriminating evidence. There were more inconsistencies. In particular, on the morning of the murder, he had sent Michelle a message in which he asked her to stop him if there was any doubt. She ordered him to act. These words sounded suspicious. It was believed that he was coordinating with his mistress. The detectives were in no hurry to bring Michelle in for questioning so as not to traumatize or scare her off. First, they wanted Thad to gather even more information, which led the detectives to Scott's workplace. The primary task was to check his computer. However, the correspondence had been deleted. Fortunately, a significant part of it was easily restored, which became a valuable source of information. The records showed that most of the messages from Scott were sent to Michelle Reynolds. He used his work computer to hide the correspondence from his wife. It all started as a routine discussion concerning the church youth group, but later the communication became increasingly personal. About a month before Thad's death, they began exchanging intimate letters regularly. They entered into a romantic relationship and planned to be together. Scott intended to leave his wife and move Michelle to Portland. While there were many ambiguous texts, there were no specific indications of malicious plans, making the situation complicated. On the day when Paige noticed that Michelle was somehow avoiding her, she was actually with Scott. This occurred during a trip related to church activities, but it did not prevent them from having sinful thoughts. The content of the letters revealed that Michelle desperately wants to break up with her husband, but Thad denied the very possibility of divorce. He was ready to do anything to keep his beautiful wife close to him, but it cost him his life. Detectives believe that, against this backdrop, Michelle realized that there was only one way to get out of this relationship: her husband's death. She did not want to shed blood with her own hands, so she sought the help of her lover. Clearly, both experienced intense feelings for each other. In search of evidence, investigators checked Scott's browser history. It turned out that he was looking for information suggesting that he wanted Thad not only to get rid of his mistress's husband but also to remain unpunished. The police eventually managed to uncover one of the key emails in which they planned the attack, intending to enter through the window when there would be fewer patrols on the streets, thereby increasing the chances of going unnoticed. Michelle played an active role in this plan, coordinating the actions when Thad left for work early on Monday morning. She immediately called her lover to order the attack. Even despite the veiled phrases and coded messages, it was obvious that early in the morning of July 5, 2004, the tragic was meant to happen. By this point, the police had gathered enough damning evidence against Michelle and Scott. The first to be arrested was Scott Harper, who was charged with first-degree murder with aggravating circumstances. Detectives hoped that he would inevitably turn on Michelle, but instead, his feelings appeared to be stronger than they expect, as he exercised his right to remain silent immediately after the arrest and refused to cooperate. However, Scott's confirmation was not necessary, as his work computer provided enough circumstantial evidence to also charge Michelle. She was arrested the same day following Scott's arrest. The detectives detained her while she was leaving her lawyer's office in the city center. She immediately refused to speak, citing her rights. When the parishioners of the church where Thad served found out that his wife and his best friend had conspired against him, everyone was shocked. They all remembered how Thad had asked everyone to pray for his wife during his life and had wished for her return after the divorce, completely unaware of the betrayal that had taken place. This could end in a bloody massacre at the hands of those closest to him. Sheath of a hunting knife was found right in Thad's office, led them to track it down to the moment of purchase in the store. Judging by the recordings from the surveillance cameras, it was Scott bought it, but now the murder weapon was missing. It was believed that the killer managed to dispose of it. Crime scene investigation results are available. The drops of blood at the crime scene turned out to be Scott's blood. Suddenly, the situation changed on July 13 when one of Scott's colleagues from the medical center where he worked contacted the police station. One of the IT department employees, who was concerned about Thad Reynolds' fate, decided to conduct his own investigation. He knew the layout of the buildings and the places where something could be carefully hidden. The object was small, and he immediately thought it was worth checking the niches under the floor through which communications and wires were laid to the office. Naturally, Scott knew about them, as he had worked in this department. To his surprise, the colleague found both the knife and bloody clothing, which he immediately reported to the police. On November 17, 2004, the preliminary stage of the hearings began, during which the order of the criminals' trials was evaluated. It was obvious that Michelle had a much better chance of avoiding imprisonment, as there was very weak evidence against her. All of it was indirect. In contrast, the evidence against Scott looked much more compelling, including the murder weapon and the bloody knife. The prosecutor believed that Scott had no chance of going unpunished, while new valuable details could come to light during the trial of the criminals. The police also found video recordings from the stores that Scott had visited, located a salesperson who remembered the man who had bought the hunting knife. A prescription from Scott's eye doctor also appeared at the crime scene. As expected, it matched the glasses found there. At the November hearing, the district attorney announced that he would seek the death penalty for both defendants. This was a clever move, as there was nothing significant against Michelle so far. The authorities hoped that Scott would be able to rectify this situation, realizing that he had nothing left to lose. It was assumed that the man would be offered a deal, which would be his only chance to avoid capital punishment. They believed that he was weak in spirit, otherwise, he would not have succumbed to the charms of Michelle, a seductress and manipulator. However, they were wrong. Scott did not give in, even under pressure from his lawyer, who believed that this was the only way to save his life. Even behind prison bars, Scott and Michelle continued to correspond. Michelle used excerpts from the Bible, highlighting certain words, while Scott composed real sentences that law enforcement officers could read. But these notes could not convince the jury, which would have been difficult. They continued to play their spy game, and they had plenty of time. Cases involving capital punishment traditionally turn into lengthy legal maneuvering on the part of the lawyers. All this dragged on for months and even years. Scott turned out to be a very persistent man and held out until the fall of 2008. After 4 years spent in prison, he finally agreed to cooperate with the police. However, even now, concerns about his mistress occupied the main place in his thoughts. Scott agreed to confess in exchange for a life sentence and also demanded that the death penalty never be used against Michelle. The deal was approved on October 1, 2008. Scott admitted his guilt. According to him, the day before the attack, Michelle had once again told him that they could not be together while Thad was alive. She had been turning her lover, Scott, against her husband for a long time, and in parallel, she was poisoning Thad with more harmful food that would kill him faster. Pressure was the last drop. Right after that, Scott went to a camping equipment store, where he bought a hunting knife. That same day, he had to deal with Thad, who usually stayed in the office later than everyone else. Scott and Michelle even went to a restaurant together, where he confessed to his failure, and then they planned the attack for the next morning. They kissed in the parking lot of the car like teenagers. When Scott arrived at Thad's office with a knife in his hands, he told Thad, "I want the same as you," and then attacked his friend. Interestingly, until this point, Michelle had never provided any testimony. By exercising her right to remain silent, her statements could be interpreted from different angles, making the trial against her a rather risky endeavor. In particular, her correspondence never directly addressed their intentions. Using encryption and veiled propositions, it was almost impossible to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. During her 6 years in prison, Michelle Reynolds changed significantly and became unrecognizable. When she spoke to the police, however, her responses were still veiled offers. Michelle avoided direct answers, stating that she felt guilty because she had an affair that led to her husband's death. Of course, this did not satisfy Thad's mother, who simply wanted Thad to know why he had to die. Michelle had no answer. Michelle eventually pleaded guilty to involuntary manslaughter and was sentenced to 20 years in prison in January 2010. Richard Scott Harper pleaded guilty to murder and received a life sentence without parole. This tragedy left a bloody mark not only on the lives of 2 families but also on the congregation. The death of the pastor, who was so cruelly murdered at the behest of his wife, was one of the most disturbing and painful events for them. Now, regarding the repose of Thad's soul, this situation caused mixed feelings. Everyone remembered how they had prayed for the Reynolds to be together, but now they could not discern whether this was divine providence or a devilish joke.